The locomotive stood sunk beneath the vaulted iron roof of Waterloo Station, its black lacquer gleaming dully in the gaslight that filtered through the morning fog. It was 11:30 on a November morning in 1804, and the platform reserved for this particular departure remained empty of the living. No porters called out arrival times, no families gathered with travelling trunks, no children pressed their faces against the carriage windows in anticipation of the journey ahead. Instead, men in dark suits moved with practiced efficiency, loading cargo that did not shuffle or complain, did not require food or water or reassurance. The freight they handled with such meticulous care had already completed the most profound journey of all. Each wooden casket bore a small brass nameplate, tarnished already by the filth of London air, marking the identity of souls who would never again breathe that poisoned atmosphere. The train carriages themselves were divided by an invisible architecture of class and faith, first-class mourners in plush velvet compartments, third-class families crammed together in hard wooden benches, and the dead themselves sorted according to the same earthly hierarchies they had known in life. Anglican caskets in certain vans, nonconformist remains in others, Catholic dead kept separate still. Even in death, Victorian propriety demanded its rigid observances. The locomotive released a long sigh of steam, a mechanical exhalation that drifted upward into the soot-darkened rafters like the collective breath of a city learning to export its mortality. The driver checked his pocket watch, noted the time in his logbook with a steady hand, and prepared to depart for a destination 23 miles distant, the largest cemetery the world had yet conceived. The Necropolis Railway was about to make its daily journey, carrying London's dead to their final resting place, and with them, secrets the living had not yet begun to suspect. Chapter 1. The City of the Dead. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, and wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour, whatever distant corner of the world holds you as darkness gathers, know that you are not alone in seeking solace in the stories of those who came before. Perhaps you are listening from a city apartment where the hum of modern life never truly ceases, or from a countryside cottage where the wind moves through ancient trees. Perhaps it is late where you are, or perhaps the day has only just surrendered to twilight. Wherever you are, whatever hour the clock marks, I invite you to let the present world recede for a time. If you have not yet done so, please consider subscribing to this channel so that we might continue these evening journeys together through history's shadowed corridors. Now, let us drift backward through the years, through the decades, through more than a century and a half, to a London that no longer exists except in crumbling photographs and the faded ink of Victorian record books. Let us go to a city choking on its own dead. The year was 1843, and London had become something unprecedented in human history. More than 2 million souls crowded into a sprawling metropolis that expanded outward with each passing month, swallowing villages and farmland, transforming the Thames Basin into an organism of brick and iron and human ambition. The railways had arrived, connecting the capital to every corner of Britain, bringing with them an endless stream of provincial families seeking fortune or simply survival in the great churning machine of empire. Factories multiplied along the riverbanks, their chimneys adding fresh layers of soot to air already thick with coal smoke. The docks received ships from every ocean, unloading goods and diseases in equal measure. And with this unprecedented concentration of life came an equally unprecedented accumulation of death. The city's ancient parish churchyards, designed to serve medieval villages of a few hundred souls, now struggled to accommodate thousands upon thousands of corpses each year. St. Martin in the Fields, St. Giles, St. Pancras, Shoreditch, Bethnal Green. Every churchyard in every district faced the same impossible arithmetic. Bodies arrived faster than the earth could receive them. The grave diggers, those men who worked in darkness with spades and lanterns, had developed techniques that would have horrified their grandfathers. They dug graves only 4 feet deep instead of the traditional 6, sometimes only 3 feet when the press of new arrivals demanded haste. They broke apart older coffins with iron bars, crushing the wood and whatever remained inside to make room for fresh burials. They stacked coffins atop one another, 6 or 7 deep, creating vertical shafts of the dead that reached nearly to the surface. When a particularly large funeral party arrived with multiple family members to be interred, the gravediggers might excavate a communal pit and arrange the coffins like cordwood, filling the spaces between with loose earth that would settle and sink as the wood below rotted away. The churchyards themselves had risen. Decades of constant burial had elevated the ground level by 10 feet, 12 feet, 15 feet in some of the older yards. The dead literally lifted the earth, creating mounds that towered above the surrounding streets. At St. Martin in the Fields, the burial ground stood so high that coffins sometimes broke through into the church vaults below. At Enon Chapel in Clement's Lane, the floor of the chapel itself served as the ceiling of a burial pit 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, where 12,000 bodies decomposed directly beneath the floorboards where worshippers knelt each Sunday. The faithful prayed while breathing air that rose from the putrefying mass below their feet. The smell was inescapable. In summer, the reek of decomposition hung over entire neighbourhoods, a sweet, corrupt thickness that clung to clothing and hair and lungs. Residents near the larger burial grounds learned to keep their windows shuttered even in the worst heat, choosing suffocation over the alternative. The gas that rose from disturbed graves sometimes ignited, creating spectral blue flames that flickered across the burial mounds at night, giving rise to stories of ghosts and demons that were not entirely imagination. The flames were corpse-light, will-o'-wisps born from methane and phosphorus released by thousands of bodies breaking down in shallow earth. The contamination spread beyond a mere smell. Wells dug near churchyards drew water that tasted of death, a flat metallic flavour that no amount of boiling could remove entirely. Cellars of houses built adjacent to burial grounds sometimes filled with a dark liquid that seeped through the walls, a leachate carrying dissolved human remains into the spaces where families stored food and coal. Physicians documented cases of fever and cholera clustering around the overcrowded burial grounds, though the mechanisms of disease transmission remained mysterious to mid-Victorian medical understanding. They spoke of miasma, of bad air, of moral corruption manifesting as physical illness, never quite grasping that they were drinking the dead. The poor suffered most acutely. Wealthy families could afford private vaults, sealed spaces of lead and stone that kept their dead contained and separate. They could purchase plots in the newer, less crowded suburban cemeteries that had begun to appear on London's outskirts. Kensal Green, Highgate, Abney Park, fashionable garden cemeteries are more modelled after the Great Père Lachaise in Paris. But the working poor, the labourers and factory hands and seamstresses who made up the vast majority of London's population had no such options. They relied on the parish burial grounds where plots might be reused within months, where a funeral meant watching your loved one lowered into earth already crowded with strangers' bones. The London newspapers began publishing accounts of burial ground horrors. The Times reported on gravediggers at St Clement Danes who had struck bone at 18 inches depth while preparing a new grave. The Morning Chronicle described scenes at Spa Fields, where body parts from recent burials protruded from the earth after heavy rains. The Illustrated London News ran an engraving showing children playing atop a burial mound while visible fragments of coffin wood littered the surface. Edwin Chadwick, the great sanitary reformer, published his investigation into the metropolitan burial grounds, documenting systematic desecration of the dead on a scale that shocked even hardened Victorian sensibilities. Parliament convened inquiries, physicians testified, clergymen defended their parish's burial practices, while admitting privately that the situation had spiralled beyond any possibility of reverent treatment of the dead. The Bishop of London acknowledged that graves were being reused within weeks rather than years, that the practice of burial in sacred ground had become a sanitary nightmare that threatened the living while offering no real sanctity to the dead. The very concept of churchyard burial that ancient practice binding the Christian dead to their parish churches for 1,000 years, had collapsed under the weight of industrial urbanisation. Entrepreneurs began to see opportunity in this crisis of mortality. If London could no longer bury its dead within the city itself, perhaps the dead might be transported elsewhere, to open land beyond the metropolitan sprawl where burial space remained abundant and cheap. The railway, that great technological marvel of the age, had already revolutionised the movement of goods and passengers across Britain. Why not apply the same principles to the transportation of the dead? The idea was not entirely without precedent. Paris had already established its great public cemeteries outside the city limits, places where the dead of all parishes could be buried in organised sanitary conditions. But Paris had not yet conceived of moving the dead by rail on an industrial scale. That innovation would belong to London, to a group of investors who saw in the city's mortality crisis both a social problem demanding solution and a commercial opportunity promising steady returns. The dead, after all, never stopped arriving. Death was the one truly reliable industry. The London Necropolis and National Mausoleum Company received its incorporation in 1852, granted by Act of Parliament the right to establish a cemetery of unprecedented scale and to construct a dedicated railway for the conveyance of both the dead and their mourners from the heart of London to burial grounds far beyond the city's margins. The company's prospectus promised dignity for the dead, profit for investors, and relief for a city drowning in its own mortality. They purchased 2,000 acres of Surrey heathland near the town of Brookwood, 23 miles southwest of London, and began transforming wilderness into the largest burial ground the world had yet conceived. The cemetery itself would be divided into sections according to the rigid social and religious hierarchies that governed Victorian life. Anglican plots separate from nonconformist ground, first-class burials with elaborate monuments and private plots, third-class interments in common graves marked only by numbered posts. The wealthy could purchase perpetual plots, ensuring their remains would rest undisturbed until the resurrection of the dead. The poor could afford only temporary space, their bodies destined for eventual removal to make room for new arrivals, practice euphemistically termed recycling in company documents. But the true innovation, the element that would transform the London Necropolis from merely another cemetery into something unprecedented, was the railway itself. The company negotiated with the London and South Western Railway to construct a dedicated funeral train service, complete with a private terminus hidden away from public view, where the dead and their mourners could board for the final journey without disturbing the living passengers using the main station. The Necropolis Railway would run on a fixed schedule, departing London each morning and returning each afternoon, carrying its peculiar cargo of coffins and grief through the industrial sprawl and out into the countryside beyond. The engineering required was substantial. Special funeral carriages had to be designed and built, vehicles fitted with racks to secure coffins during transport, and compartments to separate mourners by class and denomination. A private station had to be constructed at Waterloo, tucked away on a side street where hearses could arrive without blocking traffic. At the Brookwood end, 2 separate stations were required, one for Anglican burials in the northern section of the cemetery, another for nonconformist interments to the south. Chapels, waiting rooms, refreshment facilities all had to be provided to accommodate the particular needs of those journeying to consign their dead to the earth. The investment was considerable, but the potential returns seemed unlimited. London produced 1,500 corpses each week, more than 75,000 per year, and that number climbed steadily as the city continued its inexorable expansion. Even capturing a fraction of this mortality market would generate substantial revenue. And unlike ordinary railway passengers, the dead could not complain about service quality or choose alternative routes. They went where they were sent, accompanied by grieving families who had little choice but to accept whatever transport the burial industry provided. In November of 1854, after 2 years of construction and preparation, the London Necropolis Railway prepared for its inaugural journey. The private terminus at Westminster Bridge Road stood complete, its waiting rooms furnished, its platforms ready to receive the particular traffic for which it had been designed. The funeral carriages sat in their sidings, their interiors fitted with brass rails and velvet curtains, their exteriors painted in the company's distinctive livery. The Brookwood Cemetery waited with fresh-dug graves arranged in neat rows according to the company's carefully planned sectarian divisions. London's crisis of the dead had found its solution, a solution built of iron rails and steam engines and commercial efficiency. The Necropolis Railway would transform death itself into a scheduled service, as reliable and punctual as any other feature of Victorian industrial life. The dead would travel to their graves not by horse-drawn hearse through crowded city streets, but by locomotive through the countryside at speeds their living selves could scarcely have imagined. Mortality had become a matter of timetables and tickets, of first-class and third-class accommodations extending beyond life itself. The engine fires were lit, the carriages stood ready, and London prepared to export its dead on an unprecedented scale. Chapter 2. The consecrated ground. The land that would become Brookwood Cemetery had been wilderness for centuries. 2,000 acres of Surrey heathland 23 miles southwest of London, where nothing grew but gorse and heather and stunted pines. The soil was poor, sandy and acidic, considered worthless for agriculture. Farmers had abandoned attempts to cultivate it generations earlier, leaving the heath to rabbits and foxes and the occasional traveller passing through on the road to Southampton. The nearest settlement was the village of Brookwood itself, a scattering of cottages inhabited by a few dozen souls who made their living from the surrounding forest. No industry disturbed the silence. No great houses marked the landscape. It was empty country, or forgotten country, the kind of land that existed on the margins of maps and the edges of consciousness. This emptiness was precisely what recommended it to the directors of the London Necropolis and National Mausoleum Company. They required space on a scale that no established cemetery could provide, room enough to accommodate London's dead for centuries to come. The calculations had been precise. London produced 75,000 corpses annually, a number that would only increase as the city continued its expansion. Traditional burial practices required approximately 50 square feet per grave. Simple arithmetic revealed the magnitude of the problem. To accommodate even a single year of London's mortality demanded nearly 4 million square feet of land, roughly 90 acres. To provide burial space for a century would require 9,000 acres, assuming single-depth interments with no reuse of plots. The Brookwood site offered 2,000 acres, enough for multiple burials in each plot over time, with room for the elaborate infrastructure the company envisioned. The land was cheap, purchased for a fraction of what equivalent acreage near London would have cost. The London and South Western Railway already ran through the property, making construction of the funeral service relatively straightforward. And the remoteness that had made the land worthless for other purposes became an asset when the purpose was burial. No neighbours would complain about the proximity of the dead, no property values would be diminished. The heath could be transformed into a city of the dead without disturbing the living. The purchase was completed in 1853, and immediately the work of consecration began. The Church of England required that burial ground be formally blessed before it could receive Christian dead, a ritual that transformed ordinary earth into sacred space. The Bishop of Winchester travelled from his cathedral to perform the ceremony, processing across the heath with clergy and company directors in attendance. Holy water was sprinkled, prayers were beacon. The ancient Latin formulas that had sanctified burial grounds for 1,000 years were intoned over Surrey heathland that had never known the plough. 2/3 of the property, approximately 1,300 acres, received Anglican consecration. The remaining third was designated for nonconformists, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians and others who rejected the established church, but still required Christian burial. A small portion was set aside for those who belonged to neither category. Catholics, though Christian, were relegated to a separate section, their communion with Rome rendering them suspicious even in death. Jews received their own burial ground, carefully separated from Christian soil by walls and pathways. The irreligious, the unbaptized suicides, and those of uncertain faith would be accommodated in unconsecrated earth at the cemetery's margins. Even in a facility designed to solve London's burial crisis through modern efficiency, the old sectarian divisions persisted with undiminished force. The company hired surveyors to map the property and divide it into sections according to class and denomination. The northern portion, nearest the railway line, would be Anglican ground. The southern section, accessible by a separate station, would accommodate nonconformists. Within each section, further divisions organised the dead by their ability to pay. First-class burial plots occupied the most desirable locations along broad avenues lined with young trees, where wealthy families could erect elaborate monuments and mausoleums. Second-class plots filled the middle ground, offering permanent burial with more modest memorials. Third-class sections sprawled across the less accessible terrain, plots marked only by wooden posts bearing identification numbers, affordable to working families but offering little in the way of dignity or distinction. The poorest of London's dead, those buried at parish expense or by charitable subscription, would rest in common graves at the cemetery's furthest reaches. These graves, euphemistically termed public graves in company literature, were trenches dug to accommodate dozens of coffins stacked in layers. The company promised that even pauper burials at Brookwood would be conducted with more reverence than the shameful practices of London's overcrowded churchyards, but the economics of burial on an industrial scale demanded efficiency. The common graves would be filled systematically, layer upon layer, until each trench reached capacity. Then the earth would be mounded over and left to settle before the process began again in adjacent ground. Construction crews arrived from London, bringing with them the materials and expertise required to transform wilderness into a functioning cemetery. Roads had to be cut through the heath, broad avenues for funeral processions and narrower paths providing access to individual plots. Drainage systems were installed to prevent the burial ground from becoming waterlogged during the winter rains that plagued Surrey. Wells were sunk to provide water for the groundskeepers and for the elaborate plantings this had company intended to establish. Brookwood would not be merely a burial ground but a garden cemetery, modelled after the great landscapes of Highgate and Kensal Green, where the dead rested among carefully cultivated trees and flowering shrubs. 2 railway stations were constructed, one at the northern boundary of the Anglican section, another a mile to the south for nonconformist burials. Each station included a chapel for funeral services, waiting rooms for mourners, and platforms designed to accommodate the special funeral carriages that would arrive from London. The chapels were substantial buildings, erected in the Gothic style favoured by Victorian ecclesiastical architecture, their stone towers visible across the heath. Inside, the furnishings were sombre but respectable. Dark wood pews, stained glass windows depicting resurrection themes, altars draped in black cloth, everything calculated to provide appropriate solemnity for funeral rites conducted far from the deceased's home parish. Lodges were built to house the cemetery staff, the groundskeepers, gravediggers, and administrators who would maintain the property and coordinate the constant flow of burials arriving by rail. The company anticipated that Brookwood would require a permanent workforce of dozens, eventually hundreds as the burial ground filled and matured. These workers would need accommodation, as the cemetery's remote location made daily commuting from London impractical. Small cottages appeared along the cemetery's margins, creating a village whose sole industry was death, whose inhabitants devoted their working lives to the maintenance of the dead. The landscape itself was transformed through massive plantings. Thousands of trees were installed, pines and oaks, and chestnuts and ornamental species imported from across Britain and the continent. Rhododendrons and laurels were planted to provide evergreen screening between sections. Rose bushes were established along the main avenues. Grass seed was sown across acres of sandy soil, requiring constant watering through the first summers until the roots took hold. The company intended Brookwood to become a showpiece of Victorian cemetery design, a place where the dead rested in cultivated natural beauty rather than the grim, overcrowded desolation of urban churchyards. But beneath this carefully planned landscape of paths and plantings, the fundamental purpose remained unchanged. The earth was opened in neat rows, graves dug to uniform depth according to the class of burial they would receive. First-class graves excavated to 8 feet, deep enough to discourage disturbance and provide genuine permanence. Third-class graves dug to 6 feet, adequate for initial burial but shallow enough to permit eventual reuse if necessary. Common graves for the poor opened as trenches 15 feet deep and 30 feet long, sufficient to hold layer upon layer of coffins, arranged with brutal efficiency. The gravediggers worked in crews, moving systematically through each location, preparing the earth to receive London's dead. They were experienced men, recruited from London's burial grounds, where they had learned their trade in conditions far worse than anything Brookwood would demand. Here the earth was clean, unburdened by previous generations of the dead. Here they dug through sand and gravel, rather than the bone-filled clay of metropolitan churchyards. The work was still hard, still grim, but it was honest work without the desecration that had become routine in London. They dug, and the graves waited empty under Surrey skies. The company published elaborate promotional materials, illustrated brochures distributed to undertakers and clergy throughout London. The images showed broad tree-lined avenues, elegant chapels, peaceful landscaped grounds where the dead might rest in perpetual tranquility. The text emphasized hygiene, permanence, dignity, everything London's overcrowded burial grounds could no longer provide. Prices were listed for every class of service, from elaborate first-class funerals with private railway carriages and perpetual monument plots, down to affordable third-class burials that working families could manage through weekly payment plans or burial club subscriptions. Religious authorities gave their cautious approval. The Archbishop of Canterbury acknowledged that the traditional practice of parish churchyard burial had become untenable in modern metropolitan conditions. The Bishop of London noted that Brookwood offered a solution that preserved Christian burial practices while addressing legitimate sanitary concerns. Nonconformist leaders, long frustrated by the Anglican dominance of London's burial grounds, welcomed the promise of dedicated space where their dead could be interred according to their own denomination's practices, without Church of England interference. Medical men praised the scheme from a public health perspective. Removing the dead from the overcrowded city would eliminate a major source of disease and contamination. The Lancet published an editorial commending the London Necropolis Company for addressing through private enterprise what government had failed to solve through regulation. Edwin Chadwick, though sceptical of commercial motives, admitted that Brookwood represented a substantial improvement over existing burial conditions. The popular press was less uniformly enthusiastic. Some newspapers questioned whether the dead should be treated as freight, transported by railway like coal or manufactured goods. Others worried about accidents. What if funeral trains derailed, scattering coffins across the countryside? Religious periodicals debated whether burial so far from home parishes violated ancient Christian traditions binding the dead to their communities, but these concerns were overwhelmed by the practical reality of London's burial crisis. Something had to be done, and Brookwood offered a solution on a scale commensurate with the problem. By the autumn of 1854, the cemetery was ready to receive its first burials. The grounds had been consecrated, the graves had been dug, the chapel stood complete with their furniture and fittings installed. The railway stations waited for the first funeral trains. Staff had been hired and trained in the particular protocols the company required: how to handle coffins with appropriate reverence, how to direct mourners to correct sections according to class and denomination, how to maintain the records, ensuring each burial could be located in the vast landscape of the dead. The company directors gathered at the Anglican chapel for a final inspection before opening. They walked the broad avenues, examining the young trees that would, in decades to come, create a canopy over the graves. They toured the stations, checking that all facilities were adequate for the mourners who would soon arrive. They reviewed the record-keeping systems, the ledgers and maps that would track every burial in perpetual detail. Everything was prepared. The machinery of death had been assembled and tested. Now they awaited only the dead themselves. London, 23 miles distant, continued producing corpses at its relentless pace. The overcrowded churchyards continued receiving bodies they had no room to properly accommodate. Undertakers continued their grim commerce, preparing the dead for burial in whatever ground their families could afford. And now, for those who chose it, there was an alternative. A journey by rail to consecrated ground where space remained abundant, where the dead might rest without the crowding and desecration that had made London's burial grounds a scandal. The first funeral was scheduled for November 13th, 1854. A middle-class family from Lambeth, burying their father who had worked for 30 years as a clerk in a shipping office. They had purchased a third-class plot, affordable but permanent, marked by a simple headstone. The undertaker had made all arrangements with the Necropolis Company. The family would gather at the private terminus near Waterloo, board the funeral train, accompany their father's coffin to Brookwood, witness the burial, and return to London the same afternoon. It would be, the company promised, a dignified final journey, infinitely superior to burial in some overcrowded city churchyard, where his grave might be disturbed within months. The heath that had been empty wilderness 2 years earlier now waited to become what it would remain, a city of the dead larger than many cities of the living, a place where London's mortality would accumulate through decades and eventually centuries, layer upon layer, until the sandy Surrey soil held hundreds of thousands of bodies, perhaps millions, all transported there by the iron road that now connected the great metropolis to its final repository. The land had been prepared, the grave stood open, and the railway was ready to begin its peculiar service. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Mourning. The private terminus of the London Necropolis Railway occupied a narrow plot on Westminster Bridge Road, tucked behind the main Waterloo station where ordinary passengers caught trains to Southampton and Portsmouth and the southern counties of England. The location had been chosen for convenience. The London and South Western Railway already served Waterloo, making it practical to attach funeral operations to existing infrastructure. But the placement also reflected Victorian sensibilities about death and its proper separation from everyday life. The dead would travel by rail, but they would do so discreetly, hidden from public view, their departure managed through a dedicated facility that the living need never encounter unless they had specific cause to enter. The architects engaged for the project faced a peculiar challenge. They had to design a building that served the practical requirements of a railway terminus: platforms for boarding, cargo handling facilities, ticket offices, waiting rooms, while also accommodating the emotional and ceremonial needs of people in mourning. The structure needed to be efficient enough to process multiple funerals each day, yet dignified enough to avoid reducing grief to mere industrial procedure. It had to be unmistakably a place of death while remaining welcoming to the bereaved. It had to facilitate commerce while respecting sorrow. The solution emerged as a 2-story building in dark brick, its facade decorated with restrained Gothic details that suggested ecclesiastical architecture without fully committing to church design. The entrance opened directly from Westminster Bridge Road, marked by heavy doors and a discreet brass plaque identifying the premises as the London Necropolis station. No elaborate signage advertised its purpose to casual passers-by. Those who needed to find it knew where to look, directed by undertakers who managed the practical details of burial while families navigated the more difficult territories of grief. Inside, the ground floor was divided into 3 distinct waiting rooms, separated by class according to the rigid social hierarchies that governed Victorian Britain even in death. The first-class waiting room occupied the most favourable position, its windows offering views of a small courtyard garden planted with yew trees. The furniture was substantial: upholstered armchairs, dark wood tables, heavy curtains that could be drawn to provide privacy. A fireplace provided warmth during winter months. The walls were papered in sombre patterns, hung with framed texts of consoling scripture. Everything spoke of respectability, of means, of families accustomed to comfort who expected appropriate accommodation even while mourning. The second-class waiting room was more modest but still respectable. Wooden benches instead of upholstered chairs, plain painted walls instead of wallpaper, a smaller fireplace. But the room was clean, adequately lit, furnished with basic amenities. Families of clerks and shopkeepers, skilled tradesmen and minor professionals would find nothing to complain about in the accommodations. They were burying their dead with dignity, if not luxury. And the waiting room reflected that middle station. The third-class waiting room made no pretense to comfort. Bare benches lined the walls. The floor was plain boards rather than carpet or tile. A single small stove provided inadequate heat. The room was functional, nothing more, designed to shelter the working poor during their brief wait before boarding. These families had scraped together shillings through burial clubs or parish charity to afford even third-class interment at Brookwood. They expected no luxuries and none were provided. They sat in patient silence, accustomed to the indignities poverty imposed, grateful at least that their dead would not be consigned to the anonymous common pits of London's overcrowded churchyards. A separate entrance at the rear of the building provided access for undertakers delivering coffins. This was the cargo function of the station, the part that dealt with the dead themselves rather than their mourning survivors. Hearses arrived throughout the morning, each bearing its burden from whatever London neighbourhood had produced it. The undertaker's men carried the coffins inside, checking each against paperwork that detailed the deceased's name, the class of burial purchased, the religious denomination requiring particular handling. Mistakes were unacceptable. Sending an Anglican corpse to the nonconformist section would create complications both theological and legal. The coffins were sorted according to denomination and class, then carried through to the platform area where they would be loaded onto the appropriate railway carriage. First-class coffins, typically made of oak or mahogany with substantial brass fittings, received careful individual handling. Third-class coffins, usually constructed of cheap pine with minimal ornamentation, were moved with more efficiency than ceremony. The undertaker's men worked with practiced indifference, having long ago shed any squeamishness about handling the dead. This was labour, nothing more, a job that paid regularly and demanded only strong backs and discretion. The platform itself was unlike any other railway platform in Britain. It ran for over 200 feet, long enough to accommodate the special funeral trains that sometimes stretched to a dozen carriages or more. The platform was roofed, protecting both mourners and coffins from weather. Gas lamps hung at intervals, necessary because many funeral trains departed in early morning before full daylight. The platform surface was finished in dark tile, practical for cleaning and sombre in appearance. The funeral carriages themselves were engineering marvels, purpose-built vehicles unlike anything else running on the British rails. Each carriage was divided into compartments, with some configured to carry mourners and others fitted to transport coffins. The passenger compartments followed the standard class divisions: plush upholstery and a privacy for first-class mourners, adequate seating for second class, hard benches for third class, but the hearse carriages represented genuine innovation. These vehicles were fitted with bronze rails running the length of their interiors, designed to hold coffins secure during transport. Padded brackets prevented the caskets from shifting as the train moved. Ventilation grills in the roof allowed air circulation, necessary given the cargo. The carriages were painted in the company's distinctive livery, dark with gold lining and the London Necropolis Company monogram displayed prominently on each vehicle's side. They were handsome in their way, these iron hearses, testament to Victorian Britain's capacity for applying industrial precision to every aspect of human experience, including death. The carriages were arranged in careful order. First-class hearse carriages coupled behind the locomotive, followed by first-class passenger compartments, then second-class vehicles for both coffins and mourners. Third-class equipment brought up the rear. Even the order of the train reflected social hierarchy, positioning the wealthy dead nearest the engine while the poor trailed behind. The principle extended to platform access as well. First-class mourners boarded from the western end of the platform, third class from the eastern, with second class occupying the middle ground. The classes did not mingle, not in life and not in death. Station staff wore uniforms that marked them as railway employees, but with mourning badges sewn to their sleeves, acknowledgement that this was no ordinary transport operation. They moved through their duties with trained solemnity, helping elderly mourners navigate steps into carriages, ensuring luggage was properly stowed, checking tickets against boarding lists. They had been instructed never to smile while on duty, never to speak above a murmur, to conduct themselves with the gravity appropriate to facilitating grief. Some were former railway porters, accustomed to passenger service. Others had worked in funeral homes and brought understanding of mourning's particular requirements. The ticket office occupied a small room near the main entrance, its window facing into a narrow corridor where bereaved families queued to purchase their passage. The tickets themselves were printed on heavy cardstock, black-bordered, marked with class, date, and destination. Return tickets were available, as most mourners would travel back to London the same day after witnessing burial. Some purchased one-way passage only, intending to remain at Brookwood for private time with the grave before making their own way home by other means. The company kept meticulous records, each ticket logged with the name of the deceased, the plot number where burial would occur, the identity of the accompanying mourners. Upstairs, administrative offices managed the complex logistics of death on an industrial scale. Clerks maintained ledgers tracking every burial, when the body arrived, which plot had been assigned, which clergyman would officiate, whether the grave was perpetual or temporary, what monument, if any, had been commissioned. A diagram of the entire Brookwood property hung on one wall, the 2,000 acres divided into sections and subsections, each square representing burial plots measured in neat rows. As graves were sold, they were marked off on the diagram, a map of slowly filling space, land transformed into occupied territory one corpse at a time. The coordination required was substantial. Multiple funerals departed each day, particularly during winter months, when mortality spiked with seasonal illnesses. Each funeral required precise timing, the hearse arriving from the undertaker, the mourners gathering in appropriate waiting rooms, the coffin loaded onto the correct carriage, the whole assembly boarding the train according to a schedule that allowed the operation to repeat itself multiple times before noon. Any error could cascade into disaster, leaving families waiting hours for transport or, worse, sending someone's father or daughter or child to the wrong burial ground entirely. Telegraph equipment connected the London terminus to Brookwood, allowing instant communication about arrivals and any complications requiring adjustment of schedules. This was modern death, managed through the latest technology, coordinated with precision that would have been impossible even a generation earlier. The railway and telegraph had transformed mortality into something that could be scheduled, tracked, processed with industrial efficiency, while maintaining the surface forms of Victorian respectability. The building itself was designed to manage the emotional trajectory of mourning. Families entered from the street, leaving behind the noise and chaos of London life. They moved through the waiting rooms, spaces of enforced stillness where the reality of loss could settle over them without distraction. Then they proceeded to the platform, the liminal space between city and cemetery, between the world of the living and the final disposition of the dead. They boarded the train, sitting in dimness as London's industrial sprawl gave way to countryside. They arrived at Brookwood, witnessed burial, and returned by the same route, completing a ritual journey that imposed structure on the otherwise unbearable disorder of grief. The architects had succeeded in their peculiar commission. They had created a building that was simultaneously railway terminus and funeral home, commercial facility and sacred space, a structure that acknowledged death's practical requirements while respecting its emotional weight. The London Necropolis station would stand for 90 years, processing hundreds of thousands of funerals, becoming a familiar if unmarked feature of Westminster Bridge Road, a place the living visited only in extremity, but which served the dead with mechanical reliability. The morning of November 13th, 1854, the station opened for its first official operation. Gas lamps were lit despite the grey daylight. Fires were kindled in the waiting room hearths. Staff took their positions. The funeral train stood ready on its dedicated track, steam rising from the locomotive into the cold autumn air. The undertakers would arrive soon with their first delivery. The bereaved would follow, and the London Necropolis Railway would begin its daily service, carrying the dead from the city that could no longer accommodate them to the consecrated ground that waited 23 miles distant. The station settled into its quiet readiness, a building devoted entirely to the mechanics of mortality, where iron and steam and Victorian efficiency were enlisted in the eternal human struggle to manage death with dignity and dispose of the dead without surrendering entirely to grief or horror, or the simple animal fact that bodies must be buried or burned, or somehow removed before decay makes them unmanageable. The architecture of mourning was complete. Now it required only the mourners. Chapter 4. The First Departure. The hearse arrived at 9:30, pulling up to the rear entrance of the Westminster Bridge Road terminus, where coffins were received. The vehicle was a standard London funeral coach, black lacquered wood with glass panels revealing the casket inside, drawn by 2 horses whose harnesses were decorated with black plumes that nodded with each step. The undertaker's men climbed down from their perches and opened the rear compartment with practiced efficiency. Inside rested a coffin of modest construction, oak veneer over pine, brass handles that were plated rather than solid, the nameplate simply engraved. Thomas William Hemmings died November the 9th, 1854, aged 53 years. Thomas Hemmings had been a shipping clerk in Lambeth, employed for 3 decades by a firm that imported Baltic timber. He had worked 6 days each week, keeping manifests and coordinating deliveries, had lived in the same terraced house for 20 years, had raised 4 children to adulthood on wages that permitted respectability if not prosperity. He had belonged to a burial club that met monthly at a public house near London Bridge, each member contributing 6pence toward a collective fund that would ensure none of them ended in a pauper's grave. When pneumonia had taken him after only 5 days of illness, his widow had sufficient resources to arrange third-class burial at Brookwood, rather than consign him to the overcrowded churchyard at St Mary's where grave space had long since been exhausted. The undertaker's men carried the coffin into the station's receiving area, where a clerk checked the paperwork against his ledger. Third-class Anglican. Burial. Plot number 3847 in Section J of the Northern Grounds. The 11:15 train. Everything was in order. The coffin was carried through to the platform and loaded into the third-class hearse carriage, where it was secured with leather straps to prevent shifting during the journey. It was not the only coffin aboard. 3 others had already been loaded, and 2 more hearses were expected before departure time. The London Necropolis Railway's inaugural journey would carry 6 dead and approximately 40 mourners. The Hemmings family arrived at 10:15, filing through the main entrance into the third-class waiting room. Sarah Hemmings, the widow, was 48 years old and dressed in full mourning. Black bombazine dress, black crepe veil, black gloves, despite the relative mildness of the November morning. Her eldest daughter walked beside her, one hand supporting her mother's elbow. 2 sons followed, uncomfortable in borrowed funeral suits, their work-calloused hands scrubbed clean for the occasion. The youngest daughter had been left with neighbours, deemed too young to attend the burial. They carried no luggage beyond the widow's small purse. This was not a pleasure excursion requiring packed meals or changes of clothing. They would journey to Brookwood, witness the committal of husband and father to Surrey earth, and return to London before nightfall. Other families gradually filled the waiting room. A widow with her adult son, bearing her husband who had worked as a printer in Southwark. An elderly couple consigning their daughter to the ground, her death from consumption having come after 2 years of steady decline. A young man alone, burying his mother with funds scraped together from his wages as a dock labourer. They sat in silence on the hard benches, bound by shared grief and shared poverty, waiting for the summons to the platform. In the first-class waiting room, the atmosphere was different. Adelaide Hartwell occupied one of the upholstered chairs, attended by her brother and sister-in-law. She was burying her husband, a solicitor who had succumbed to heart failure at age 62. The first-class funeral had cost £20, a sum representing more than a year's wages for someone like Thomas Hemmings. But the Hartwells had the means, and Adelaide would not have her husband buried among common labourers. His coffin was mahogany with solid brass fittings, the nameplate elaborately engraved. His plot at Brookwood was perpetual, marked on the cemetery diagram for a monument she would commission once the ground had settled. She sipped tea provided by station staff, composing herself for the ordeal ahead with the fortitude expected of her class. At 11 o'clock precisely, a bell rang through the station. The staff moved to each waiting room, informing the mourners that boarding would commence shortly. The families rose from their benches and chairs, gathering themselves, the women adjusting their veils, the men settling their hats. They filed out to the platform in their separate streams, first class from the western end, third class from the eastern, each class directed to their appropriate carriages. The Hemmings family climbed wooden steps into their third-class compartment, settling onto benches that would not have been out of place in a common omnibus. The compartment held 12 passengers, and gradually it filled with other mourners, the printer's widow, the elderly couple, strangers bound together by mortality and the economics of burial. The door was closed but not locked. Gas lamps provided dim illumination. Through the window, they could see the platform, and beyond it, the brick wall that separated the Necropolis terminus from Waterloo's main station, where ordinary passengers waited for ordinary trains to ordinary destinations. Mrs. Hartwell and her party occupied a first-class compartment that seated 6 in upholstered privacy. Curtains could be drawn across the windows to shield occupants from outside view. The gas fixtures were polished brass rather than painted iron. The floor was carpeted. She settled into her seat with her mourning handkerchief clutched in one gloved hand, her brother sitting opposite in respectful silence. They would not have to share this space with strangers. First-class mourning was conducted in isolation appropriate to gentility. At 11:12, the locomotive released a long whistle, a sound that cut through the November air with mechanical authority. The station master checked his pocket watch, confirmed the time, and signalled to the driver. Steam hissed. The coupling chains took up slack with a series of metallic clanks that travelled the length of the train from engine to rear carriage. The wheels began to turn. The funeral train rolled slowly out of Westminster Bridge Road station, leaving behind the private terminus for the junction where it would connect with the main line of the London and South Western Railway. The movement was smooth, much smoother than carriage travel over London's rutted streets. The Hemmings family sat in silence as their compartment glided past the rear walls of Waterloo Station, past goods yards and engine sheds, past the industrial clutter that accumulated around every major railway terminus. Within minutes, the train was travelling through South London's densely packed neighbourhoods. Terraced houses pressed close to the railway line, their rear yards and gardens visible from the carriage windows. Washing hung on lines between buildings. Children played in narrow alleys. Women stood in doorways watching the train pass with the brief attention people give to familiar sights. None of them knew they were watching a funeral train, that the carriages contained both the dead and those who mourned them. The train looked like any other, its exterior giving no obvious indication of its peculiar cargo. The locomotive gained speed as the track cleared the most congested districts. The rhythmic clatter of wheels over the rail joints became a steady background, almost meditative in its repetition. Sarah Hemmings stared through the window without seeing. Her thoughts turned inward to 30 years of marriage, to the empty house awaiting her return, to the practical questions of survival that would demand attention once this day was finished. Her sons sat with arms crossed, faces expressionless, displaying the stoicism expected of working men confronted with loss. Her daughter dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, the only visible display of grief in the compartment. The train passed through Clapham, through Wimbledon, leaving behind the continuous sprawl of London for a landscape that became progressively more rural. Terraced houses gave way to detached villas with gardens. the villas thinned to scattered cottages separated by fields. The suburbs dissolved into genuine countryside, Surrey farmland and woodland rolling away from the railway line in gentle undulations. It was landscape most third-class passengers rarely saw, their lives bound to London's streets and factories, their occasional excursions limited to walking distance from home. The dead man in the hearse carriage ahead was travelling farther from London than he had journeyed in years, perhaps decades. In the first-class compartment, Mrs. Hartwell watched the changing landscape with detached attention. She and her late husband had owned a small country house in Sussex, had travelled regularly by rail for weekend retreats. The countryside held no novelty for her. But the context made everything strange. She was not travelling toward leisure, but toward the permanent disposal of the man with whom she had shared her life. The familiar rhythm of rail travel, usually associated with anticipation and pleasure, now carried only the weight of finality. The locomotive pulled the train through stations without stopping. Earlsfield, Rains Park, Malden, places where ordinary passengers boarded and alighted, going about their business while the funeral train passed through without pause. The schedule allowed no delays. The dead were expected at Brookwood on time. The cemetery staff awaited the train's arrival to coordinate with gravediggers and clergy, ensuring each burial proceeded according to plan. At Surbiton, the train switched to a branch line that diverged from the main track towards Southampton. This was the final stretch, the last few miles before Brookwood. The landscape became more wooded, pine and oak replacing the cultivated farmland. The railway ran through cuts blasted through sandy hillocks, past heathland where gorse bloomed yellow even in November. The wheel's rhythm remained constant, carrying the dead and their mourners deeper into Surrey's quiet countryside, away from everything the deceased had known in life. 43 minutes after departing Westminster Bridge Road, the funeral train began to slow. Through the windows, the mourners could see the Brookwood Cemetery grounds appearing on the northern side of the track. Young trees planted in neat rows, open graves marked by the mounded earth. A chapel tower rising above the plantings. The locomotive released steam with a prolonged hiss as it drew into the North Station, the Anglican terminal of the London Necropolis Railway. The platform was longer than the one at Westminster Bridge Road, built to accommodate trains larger than today's inaugural service. A covered colonnade connected the platform to the chapel, allowing mourners to proceed from train to funeral service without exposure to weather. Cemetery staff waited in dark uniforms, ready to assist with unloading coffins and directing families to appropriate locations. A clergyman stood at the chapel entrance, prayer book in hand, prepared to conduct the first of the day's committal services. The train came to a complete stop. Doors opened. The mourners descended to the platform, their legs stiff from sitting, their faces revealing the strain of the journey and the ordeal still ahead. The undertaker's men emerged from the hearse carriages, working quickly to unload the coffins onto wheeled biers. Each coffin was checked against paperwork to ensure correct assignment to the waiting graves. Mistakes at this stage would be catastrophic, consigning bodies to wrong plots, rendering the elaborate record-keeping meaningless. The Hemmings family followed their designated station attendant along the colonnade toward the chapel. Around them, other families moved in similar processions, each group isolated in private grief despite their proximity. The chapel was plain inside, furnished with dark wood pews arranged before a simple altar. No elaborate decoration disturbed the solemn functionality. This was a place for conducting necessary rituals before proceeding to the actual burial, not a sanctuary for extended worship. 6 coffins were arranged before the altar, separated by enough space to maintain individual dignity. The clergyman took his position and opened his prayer book. The mourners settled into pews, organised by family groups. Sarah Hemmings sat in the front row with her children, staring at the coffin that held all that remained of her husband. The wood gleamed dully in the chapel's dim gaslight. The brass plate reflected distorted shapes. Inside that sealed container was the body she had washed and prepared for burial, the face she had kissed one final time before the undertaker closed the lid. The service was brief, efficient, designed to be repeated multiple times each day as successive funeral trains arrived. The clergyman read the prescribed prayers, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who spoke these words regularly. He recited the committal formula, that ancient language acknowledging human mortality and promising resurrection. He offered no personal remarks about the deceased. He had never met Thomas Hemmings or any of the others whose coffins rested before him. He was a functionary of the burial industry, performing necessary rites with appropriate solemnity but without personal investment. After 20 minutes, the service concluded. The mourners rose and filed back outside where gravediggers had loaded the coffins onto handcarts for transport to their final locations. The Hemmings family followed their handcart along a gravel path that wound through the young plantings towards Section J. The grave had been dug that morning, the earth piled neatly beside the opening, the sandy soil lighter than the heavy clay of London's burial grounds. A simple wooden post marked the plot number. Eventually, if the widow could afford it, a headstone might be erected. For now, the numbered post would serve. The coffin was lowered by ropes, the gravediggers working with efficient coordination to prevent any undignified fumbling. The clergyman spoke the final words, ashes to ashes and dust to dust, and invited the family to cast earth into the grave. Sarah Hemmings bent stiffly, taking a handful of sandy soil, letting it fall onto the coffin lid, where it scattered with a sound like rain. Her children followed, each taking their turn. Then they stepped back, and the gravediggers began filling the grave with practiced speed, their spades moving in rhythm, the earth gradually covering the coffin until nothing remained visible except a mound that would settle in time. The burial was complete. Thomas Hemmings rested in Surrey earth, far from the London streets he had walked for 50 years, far from the house where his widow would return to faith the remainder of her life alone. The London Necropolis Railway had carried him to this remote place, and would carry his family back to the city before evening. The machinery of Victorian death had processed another corpse, with industrial efficiency and appropriate ceremonial gestures, transforming a human life into a filled grave marked by a numbered post in 2,000 acres of consecrated ground. The Hemmings family walked back toward the North Station, where the funeral train waited to return to London. Behind them, gravediggers moved to the next burial site, preparing to repeat the process for the printer from Suffolk. The afternoon would bring more trains, more coffins, more grieving families processing through the same sequence of chapel service and graveside committal. The London Necropolis Railway had begun its daily operation, a service that would continue for decades, carrying tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of dead from the overcrowded city to this ever-expanding cemetery in the Surrey countryside. The first departure had been completed successfully. The dead had travelled by rail to their graves. The system worked precisely as designed, and London's crisis of mortality had found its iron solution. Chapter 5. The Hierarchies of Heaven. The London Necropolis Railway maintained distinctions of class with the same rigid precision that governed every other aspect of Victorian society. The company's promotional literature promised appropriate accommodation for all social stations, from the wealthiest families of Belgravia to the humblest labourers of Whitechapel. But this promise of universal service concealed a brutal truth. Even in death, perhaps especially in death, money purchased dignity while poverty guaranteed degradation. The railway and cemetery together formed a vast machine for processing mortality, and like all Victorian institutions, it sorted human beings according to their economic worth before consigning them to eternity. The fare structure told the story plainly. A first-class funeral at Brookwood cost between £15 and £20, depending on the elaboration of services requested. This sum represented 6 months' wages for a skilled tradesman, a year's income for a factory worker, an impossible fortune for the casual labourers who made up a substantial portion of London's population. In exchange for this expense, the wealthy dead received mahogany or oak coffins with solid brass fittings, private railway compartments for mourners, individual graves dug to 8 feet depth in the most desirable cemetery locations, and perpetual rights to the plot. Their families could erect monuments of marble or granite, elaborate Victorian confections of angels and urns and draped columns, permanent markers ensuring the deceased would be remembered as long as stone endured. Second-class burial cost between £3 and £5, accessible to the respectable working class and lower middle-class families who had saved through burial clubs or received assistance from employers or fraternal organisations. These dead travelled in shared hearse carriages and their mourners sat on wooden benches rather than upholstered seats, but they received individual graves marked by modest headstones, permanent plots that would not be disturbed for reuse. The coffins were simpler, pine or elm with plated brass handles, but they were substantial enough to maintain dignity. The graves were dug to 6 feet rather than 8, adequate if not generous. These families purchased respectability, a middle station that separated them from the truly poor without pretending to gentility. Third-class burial represented the minimum that could be called decent interment. For 30 shillings, a family could secure a grave at Brookwood marked by a wooden post rather than stone. Burial in a simple pine coffin. Transport on the funeral train in the cheapest carriages. These graves occupied the less desirable sections of the cemetery, farther from the main avenues and chapels, in soil that was rocky or poorly drained. The plots were technically permanent, but the company reserved the right to reuse them after 75 years if no monument had been erected and no family member came forward to maintain the grave. This was poverty's version of immortality, a numbered post slowly weathering in remote corners of the cemetery, eventually forgotten, the grave's occupant reduced to a line in ledgers that no one would ever consult. Below third class existed a category the company's promotional materials barely acknowledged: the pauper burials, bodies consigned to Brookwood at parish expense when families lacked even 30 shillings for individual interment. These dead had no privacy, no individual dignity, no possibility of commemoration. They travelled in plain wooden boxes, sometimes mere shrouds, loaded into hearse carriages like cargo being shipped to warehouse storage. At Brookwood, they were buried in common graves, trenches 15 feet deep and 30 feet long that received coffins in stacked layers, dozens of bodies per trench, separated by thin layers of earth that would compress as the wood rotted and collapsed. The gravediggers worked these common graves with brutal efficiency. They excavated the trenches during winter months, when groundwater tables dropped and digging was easier. The first layer of coffins went into the bottom, arranged side by side like books on a shelf. Earth was shoveled over them just enough to provide separation from the next layer. Then another row of coffins, stacked directly atop the first, more earth, another layer. The process continued until the trench was filled to within 3 feet of the surface, at which point a final covering was mounded over and seeded with grass. A single numbered post marked each common grave, identifying not an individual but a collective burial containing anywhere from 20 to 50 bodies, whose names existed only in cemetery ledgers. The company insisted these mass burials were conducted with more reverence than the shameful practices of London's overcrowded churchyards. And technically this was true. The bodies at Brookwood were buried in uncrowded ground, in soil that had never held previous dead, without the bone-breaking and coffin-crushing that had become routine in metropolitan burial grounds. But reverence was relative. The poor dead of Brookwood received assembly line burial, their bodies processed in batches, their individual identities erased by the economics of industrial-scale interment. They had escaped London's burial crisis only to become components in Surrey's growing inventory of the anonymous dead. The cemetery's physical layout reinforced these class divisions with geographic precision. The first-class sections occupied the most attractive locations along the main avenues near the north and south stations. These areas received the most intensive landscaping, mature trees transplanted at great expense, ornamental shrubs arranged in careful patterns, grass maintained with regular cutting and watering. The paths were broad and well gravelled, allowing carriage access for elderly mourners. Benches provided places for contemplation. The effect was that of a cultivated park, a Victorian Garden Cemetery where death was domesticated through horticultural effort and architectural elaboration. The first-class plots themselves ranged from simple individual graves to elaborate family vaults that resembled small houses. Wealthy families commissioned mausoleums in Gothic or classical styles, structures of granite and marble fitted with iron doors and stained glass windows. Inside, the dead rested in sealed lead coffins stacked on shelves, family members accumulating through generations in private chapels where their descendants could gather for remembrance without exposure to weather or the proximity of common graves. These mausoleums cost hundreds of pounds to construct, small fortunes dedicated to ensuring the dead maintained their separation from lesser mortals even underground. The monuments varied according to taste and means, but all proclaimed the wealth required to erect them. Angels in Italian marble pointed heavenward with fingers that would endure centuries. Draped urns symbolized mortality with expensive symbolism. Obelisks reached toward the sky, Egyptian forms repurposed for Victorian sensibilities. Celtic crosses combined Christian and pre-Christian imagery in elaborate stone carvings. Broken columns represented lives cut short, though most of those commemorated had lived well into their 60s or 70s. Every monument competed for attention, transforming the first-class sections into galleries of funerary art where grief expressed itself through conspicuous expenditure. The inscriptions on these monuments told stories of accomplished lives, military service, professional achievement, familial devotion. Colonel James Harrington died 1862, veteran of the Peninsular Campaign. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, beloved wife and mother, 1829 to 1871. Sir Thomas Radcliffe, Justice of the Peace, died 1868, aged 74 years. The dead identified themselves by their titles, their relationships, their ages, their virtues. They had been someone in life, and their monuments ensured they would remain someone in death, at least until weather and pollution eroded the inscriptions into illegibility. The second-class sections occupied middle ground in both location and appearance. The landscaping was adequate rather than elaborate, grass maintained but not manicured, trees planted at wider intervals, shrubs selected for hardiness rather than ornamental value. The paths were narrower, the gravel less frequently renewed. No benches interrupted the rows of graves. Carriages could access the main routes but not the smaller paths between sections. This was respectable burial ground, nothing more. Space where the middling classes could rest in permanent plots without pretending to grandeur they had never achieved in life. The monuments reflected modest means. Simple headstones of local stone rather than imported marble, inscriptions brief and factual, decorative elements limited to basic crosses or floral patterns. Thomas William Hemmings, 1801 to 1854. Sarah Porter died March 1859, aged 43 years. James Crawford, 1815 to 1867, at rest. These stones announce nothing beyond names and dates, marking graves without attempting to memorialize lives. The inscriptions would fade more quickly than those carved in expensive marble, the local stone more vulnerable to Surrey's rain and frost. Within decades, many would become illegible. Within a century, the majority would be unreadable, the graves identifiable only by their shapes and positions. The third-class sections sprawled across the least desirable cemetery lands, areas with poor drainage that became muddy in winter, slopes too steep for easy access, corners remote from chapels and stations. The landscaping was minimal, consisting mainly of whatever vegetation grew naturally on disturbed ground. Paths were often just trampled earth rather than gravelled surfaces. No trees provided shade. The graves stretched in endless rows, marked by wooden posts that weathered to grey within a few years. Numbers painted on the posts faded quickly, requiring periodic renewal if the graves were to remain identifiable at all. Many third-class families never erected monuments, lacking funds for even the simplest headstone. The graves remained marked only by their numbered posts, eventually by nothing at all as the wood rotted and collapsed. The dead became anonymous. their graves indistinguishable from surrounding ground once vegetation covered the slight depressions left by settled earth. The cemetery records maintained their names and plot locations, but records were consulted only when families made specific inquiries. For practical purposes, these dead had vanished, buried and forgotten, in remote corners of 2,000 acres that few visitors explored. The common graves for pauper burials occupied the furthest margins of the cemetery, land so remote that mourners rarely attended the interments. Most pauper funerals consisted solely of the coffin delivery and burial. No service, no ceremony, just gravediggers lowering boxes into trenches and shoveling earth over them. The parish priests who occasionally attended these burials spoke the committal prayers over multiple coffins at once, efficiency demanded by the constant flow of bodies. The dead had no individual moment of consecration, no personal acknowledgement. They were processed in batches, units in the great accounting of metropolitan mortality. The cemetery maintained separate sections for different religious denominations, divisions that persisted even within class categories. The northern grounds were Anglican, consecrated by the Bishop of Winchester according to Church of England rites. The southern grounds served nonconformists, Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and the various splinter sects that refused submission to the established church. A separate area accommodated Catholics, whose communion with Rome rendered them suspect even in death. Jews received their own burial ground, carefully walled off from Christian soil. Each denomination maintained its own ritual practices, its own understanding of proper burial, its own certainty that their dead alone rested in ground acceptable to their particular vision of God. These sectarian divisions created administrative complications that the company navigated with careful attention to detail. Each funeral required correct assignment not only to appropriate class sections but to proper denominational ground. Mistakes generated complaints and occasionally lawsuits. The company employed religious advisors to review questionable cases, whether a particular family belonged to the Anglican or nonconformist category, whether someone who had converted to Catholicism late in life qualified for Catholic burial, whether the unbaptized could be interred in consecrated ground or must be relegated to the cemetery's unconsecrated margins. The funeral trains themselves embodied these divisions. The carriages were segregated not only by class but by denomination. Anglican mourners and coffins travelled in certain vehicles, nonconformists in others. The train stopped first at the North Station for Anglican burials, then continued to the South Station for nonconformist interments. Mourners did not mingle. The company provided separate waiting rooms, separate chapels, separate cemetery staff for each denominational section. The dead were kept apart according to theological distinctions that would have been invisible to anyone outside Victorian Britain's peculiar religious landscape. The chapel services reflected denominational preferences with careful precision. Anglican funerals followed the Book of Common Prayer, that ancient liturgy unchanged since the 16th century. Nonconformist services varied according to each denomination's practices. Baptist funerals with their emphasis on adult baptism and scripture, Methodist services with hymn singing, Presbyterian ceremonies conducted according to their austere traditions. Catholic burials involved priests' investments, Latin prayers, ritual gestures foreign to Protestant observers. Jewish burials followed completely different traditions. Conducted without Christian clergy, the bodies wrapped in simple shrouds rather than enclosed in coffins, buried within 24 hours of death according to ancient Jewish law. The cemetery staff learned to navigate these religious complexities with professional detachment. They coordinated with Anglican rectors and Baptist ministers and Catholic priests and Jewish rabbis, ensuring each denomination received burial according to its particular requirements. They memorized which sections were consecrated and which were not, which plots could receive Christian burial and which were reserved for those outside the faith. They became experts in theological minutiae that governed the disposal of the dead, knowledge that meant nothing to them personally but everything to families who cared deeply about such distinctions. The result was a vast landscape of division, 2,000 acres organised according to the hierarchies that governed Victorian life. Wealth purchased elevation, both literal and figurative. The first-class sections occupied high ground with good drainage and attractive views. The third-class sections filled low-lying areas prone to waterlogging. The pauper graves occupied waste ground at the cemetery's margins, land considered unsuitable for anything else. Class distinctions that shaped life persisted in death, inscribed into the landscape itself, visible in the quality of monuments and paths and landscaping, in the proximity to chapels and stations, in every detail of burial ground organisation. The dead lay arranged according to their economic value, their religious affiliations, their social stations. The railway that brought them to Brookwood had sorted them by class before they left London, had maintained those divisions throughout the journey, had delivered them to separate stations serving separate grounds where they would rest in eternal separation. Victorian Britain, that society of rigid hierarchies and careful distinctions, had created a necropolis that perfectly reflected its values. Even heaven, it seemed, would maintain class divisions, would sort souls according to their earthly means, would preserve forever the inequalities that had governed their mortal lives. The landscaping matured as years passed, the young trees growing tall, the grass thickening over graves old and new, but the fundamental organisation never changed. The wealthy remained near the main avenues in their marble monuments. The respectable working class occupied their middle sections with modest headstones. The poor sprawled in remote corners marked by weathering posts, and the paupers filled their common graves, anonymous multitudes buried in earth that would receive layer after layer of London's expendable dead, bodies stacked like cordwood in trenches that never quite filled completely, because there were always more coming, always more poor dying in the city 23 miles distant, always more coffins arriving by the iron road that connected London's poverty to Surrey's consecrated ground. The hierarchies of heaven had been established, and they looked remarkably like the hierarchies of earth. Chapter 6. The Servants of Saints. The London Necropolis Railway required a particular kind of worker, men who could perform their duties with mechanical efficiency while maintaining appropriate solemnity in the presence of death and grief. The company employed dozens in London and hundreds at Brookwood, creating an entire professional class devoted to the machinery of burial. These were the servants of saints, labourers whose daily work brought them into constant contact with mortality until death itself became ordinary. Another industrial process requiring skilled management and steady nerves. The station master at Westminster Bridge Road terminus was a man named Edward Bright, 47 years old, who had previously worked for the London and South Western Railway as a goods supervisor before accepting the Necropolis Company's offer in 1854. He had been chosen for his organisational abilities and his capacity for discretion. His responsibilities included coordinating funeral train schedules, managing platform staff, ensuring coffins were correctly matched to paperwork, and dealing with bereaved families whose grief sometimes expressed itself in ways that disrupted efficient operations. He kept a pocket watch that he consulted constantly, maintaining the precise timing that allowed multiple funerals to be processed each morning without delay or confusion. Bright dressed always in black, a necessity given his occupation, his clothing maintained to standards of respectability that reassured families they were dealing with professionals rather than mere labourers. He spoke in quiet tones, had trained himself to move without hurried gestures, presented himself as a man in complete control of circumstances that were, by their nature, difficult for everyone else. He had learned to recognise the signs of impending collapse, the widow who seemed steady but was actually moments from fainting, the son who maintained composure through visible effort, the daughter whose tears had exhausted themselves into numb silence. He kept smelling salts in his office for those who required them, had developed a practiced sympathy that could be deployed and withdrawn as circumstances demanded. The work had changed him in ways he sometimes recognised during evening hours when he returned to his lodgings in Lambeth. He had become accustomed to death's presence, had lost the instinctive recoil that most people felt when confronted with mortality. He could look at a coffin and see only an object requiring transport, could stand beside an open grave without contemplating his own future residence in similar excavations. Death had become his business, as mundane as shipping timber or trading securities. This transformation troubled him occasionally, when he thought about it, which he tried not to do. His staff consisted of porters, ticket clerks, and platform attendants, men selected for their ability to perform physically demanding work while maintaining appropriate demeanour. They loaded coffins, directed mourners, cleaned the waiting rooms between funerals, ensured the gas lamps remained lit and the fires burned in the hearths during winter months. They were paid slightly better than ordinary railway workers, compensation for the peculiar demands of their employment. Not everyone could handle the work. Some men lasted only days before deciding they preferred labour that did not require constant proximity to the dead. The funeral train drivers were regular London and South Western Railway employees who operated Necropolis services as part of their normal rotations. They received no special training for these assignments beyond instructions about the required stops and the need for smooth operation to prevent coffins from shifting in the hearse carriages. Most drivers treated the Necropolis runs as easier than ordinary passenger services. No crowds to manage, no complicated scheduling connecting to other lines, just a straightforward journey from London to Brookwood and back. The dead were undemanding passengers, and the mourners rarely complained about delays or service quality. At Brookwood, the cemetery employed a much larger workforce. The superintendent was a former army officer named Colonel William Hayter, who ran the facility with military precision. He maintained offices in a small building near the North Station, where he managed the complex logistics of burial on an industrial scale. His responsibilities included coordinating gravediggers, scheduling clergy, assigning plots according to class and denomination, maintaining grounds, and ensuring the cemetery remained in condition appropriate to its function as London's primary burial ground. He reported directly to the company directors in London, providing weekly summaries of burials conducted, revenues collected, and any complications requiring attention. Hayter had served in India during the 1840s, had witnessed cholera epidemics and battlefield casualties, had developed the administrative skills required to process mass mortality without losing efficiency or morale. The Brookwood position had attracted him precisely because it combined his military organisational experience with his desire for civilian employment that still offered opportunities for command. He ran the cemetery like a military installation, inspecting grounds daily, holding regular staff meetings, maintaining discipline among workers whose labour required constant supervision to prevent the shortcuts that would compromise cemetery standards. The gravediggers were the cemetery's essential workforce, men who spent their days opening the earth and filling it again, creating the cavities that would receive London's dead. The work was physically demanding, requiring strength to excavate graves to proper depth and stamina, to maintain production schedules that sometimes demanded 6 or 8 graves dug in a single day. The men worked in teams, 2 diggers per grave for standard burials, larger crews for family vaults or the common trenches that received pauper bodies. Most gravediggers had learned their trade in London's churchyards, where conditions were far worse than anything Brookwood demanded. They had dug through soil filled with previous generations of dead, had broken apart old coffins to make room for new ones, had breathed air thick with decomposition gases, had handled human remains in various states of preservation. Brookwood, by comparison, was clean work. Tier. The sandy Surrey soil was easy to excavate, free of bones and coffin fragments. The graves were properly spaced, allowing each burial its own ground. The pay was steady, the labour no more difficult than construction work or canal digging. But the psychological weight of the work revealed itself in the gravediggers' behaviour during off hours. They drank heavily, most of them gathering at public houses near Brookwood Village, where they could forget temporarily that their labour consisted entirely of preparing receptacles for human bodies. They joked about death with gallows humour that horrified civilians who overheard their conversations. They had developed an emotional callousness necessary for anyone who spent entire days surrounded by mortality, who saw death not as tragedy, but as the raw material of employment. The cemetery employed groundskeepers who maintained the landscaping, men who planted trees and shrubs, cut grass, trimmed hedges, removed dead vegetation. This work was less psychologically demanding than grave digging, though it still required comfortable proximity to the dead. The groundskeepers worked among thousands of graves, their labour constantly reminding them of the cemetery's purpose. They learned to ignore the monuments, to see the landscape as simply landscape rather than as memorial to accumulated mortality. The older groundskeepers could remember when Brookwood had been empty heath, and they watched year by year as the burial grounds expanded, consuming more and more of the original wilderness. The chaplains employed by the cemetery were clergymen who had accepted positions that more successful men avoided. Conducting funeral after funeral, day after day, speaking the same prayers over strangers' coffins, became spiritually exhausting in ways that parish ministry never approached. The cemetery chaplains were typically younger men early in their careers, or older clergymen whose ambitions had been disappointed. They performed their duties with professional competence, but few maintained genuine emotional investment in the constant stream of burials they conducted. The Reverend Charles Wilkinson served as Anglican chaplain at the North Station from 1856 until his death in 1863. He conducted an average of 8 funerals each day, speaking the committal service from the Book of Common Prayer so many times that the words became automatic, emerging from his mouth without requiring conscious thought. He developed strategies to maintain focus, varying his inflection, pausing at different points in the liturgy, deliberately looking at the coffin to remind himself that each wooden box contained someone who had lived and died and deserved more than a mechanical recitation. But the strategies only partly succeeded. Wilkinson recorded in his diary, never intended for publication, that the work had hollowed him spiritually. He had entered the ministry believing he would comfort the afflicted and guide souls towards salvation. Instead, he had become a functionary in a burial industry, speaking prescribed words over dead strangers, while their families stood in numbed silence. He questioned whether his labour had any genuine religious meaning, or whether he was simply another cog in the machinery of Victorian death management. The questions troubled him until the consumption that had weakened him for months finally stopped his breathing one February morning, making him briefly the subject rather than officiant of Brookwood's burial rituals. The undertakers who delivered bodies to the necropolis terminus were independent businessmen who contracted with families to manage all aspects of funeral arrangements. They purchased coffins from specialized manufacturers, hired mutes to attend funerals, coordinated with clergy and cemetery officials, handled the deceased body from death through burial. The work required both business acumen and comfort with mortality's physical realities. Undertakers prepared bodies for burial, washing them, dressing them in shrouds or burial clothes, arranging them in coffins with appropriate dignity. The trade had expanded dramatically during the Victorian period as death became increasingly professionalised. Earlier generations had managed their own dead, washing and laying out bodies at home, arranging burial through direct contact with parish clergy. But as urban populations grew and traditional community structures weakened, families increasingly turned to commercial undertakers who possessed the expertise and equipment necessary for managing death's practical requirements. The undertakers filled this niche profitably, charging fees that ranged from a few shillings for basic pauper services to hundreds of pounds for elaborate first-class funerals. Some undertakers specialised in necropolis burials, maintaining regular relationships with cemetery staff, understanding the paperwork requirements and scheduling procedures. They guided families through decisions about class of burial, denomination, monument selection, ensuring their clients understood options while steering them towards choices that generated appropriate profit. The successful undertakers combined sympathy with salesmanship, expressing genuine condolence while recommending more expensive coffins, or more elaborate services than families might have initially considered. The railway company employed its own funeral furnishers who managed the hearse carriages and ensured coffins were properly secured during transport. These men worked at the Westminster Bridge Road terminus, loading bodies onto the trains each morning, checking that straps were tight and that no coffins would shift during the journey. They developed professional pride in their work, competing informally to achieve the fastest loading times while maintaining standards of reverence. A coffin dropped or roughly handled brought immediate reprimand from the station master, as the company insisted that bodies be treated with respect regardless of the class of burial purchased. At Brookwood, a separate crew unloaded the coffins and transported them to graves on wheeled biers or handcarts, depending on the terrain and the coffin's weight. These men learned to coordinate their movements, lifting in unison, maintaining smooth progress across uneven ground, lowering bodies into graves without fumbling or dropping. The work required physical strength but also careful attention, as mistakes became immediately obvious and generated complaints from families who were watching their loved ones' final disposition. The cemetery employed administrative clerks who maintained the elaborate record-keeping systems that tracked every burial conducted at Brookwood. Each interment generated paperwork, the burial order from the undertaker, the train manifest, the plot assignment, the grave diagram showing exact location, the denominational certification confirming appropriate religious ground. The clerks filed these documents in perpetuity, creating archives that documented in meticulous detail the accumulating population of the dead. These records allowed families to locate graves years or decades after burial, ensured plots were not accidentally reused, provided legal documentation of interment for inheritance and estate purposes. The clerks worked in offices heated by coal stoves during winter, lit by gas lamps year-round, surrounded by filing cabinets that gradually filled with mortality's paperwork. The work was tedious but important, requiring attention to detail and tolerance for repetitive labour. The clerks rarely saw the graves they documented, rarely attended funerals, rarely encountered the families whose dead they recorded. They worked in abstraction, managing death through paperwork rather than physical presence, transforming burial into information that could be filed, retrieved, and preserved indefinitely. The cemetery workers developed their own culture, their own social network centered on their shared occupation. They married women from Brookwood Village or from among the cemetery's female staff, cleaners and laundresses who maintained the chapel linens and cleaned the waiting rooms. They raised children who grew up playing among graves, who accepted mortality as ordinary background to daily life. Some of these children eventually joined the cemetery workforce themselves, creating family lineages devoted to burial industry labour. The workers referred to the cemetery in shorthand that would have disturbed civilians, the grounds, or simply the yard. They spoke of graves by number rather than by the names of the dead who occupied them. They discussed their work in technical terms stripped of emotional content, soil conditions, drainage issues, scheduling complications. This vocabulary allowed them to function without constant confrontation with death's meaning. They could not afford to contemplate mortality philosophically while simultaneously digging its graves and maintaining its landscape. But the work marked them nonetheless. The cemetery workers carried about them an association with death that made some people uncomfortable in social situations. Shopkeepers in Brookwood Village sometimes hesitated before serving men they knew spent their days among graves. Women occasionally declined marriage proposals from gravediggers, unwilling to sleep beside someone whose hands had lowered countless bodies into earth. The workers learned to conceal their occupation when possible, to describe themselves vaguely as railway workers or groundskeepers, rather than acknowledge their direct involvement in burial industry labour. Yet the work continued, day after day, year after year. The funeral trains arrived each morning, bringing their cargo of coffins and mourners. The station staff managed the arrivals, coordinated the services, directed families to graves. The gravediggers opened the earth, and the chaplains spoke their prayers, and the cemetery clerks filed their paperwork. The servants of silence performed their duties with professional competence, transforming mortality into routine, making death itself just another job requiring management and steady wages. They were the hidden workers of Victorian death management, the men and women whose labour made possible the industrial-scale burial that solved London's crisis of the dead. Without them, the London Necropolis Railway could not have functioned. Without them, Brookwood would have been merely empty ground rather than a functioning cemetery. They were essential, these servants of silence, even though their work remained largely invisible to the families they served, even though their names appeared in no memorial inscriptions, even though they lived and died in obscurity while managing the more dramatic deaths of thousands. The machinery of burial required human operators, and they provided the labour that kept it functioning. Chapter 7. The Weight of Empire. The London Necropolis Railway carried more than civilian dead. By the early 1860s, Britain's imperial ambitions had scattered military forces across the globe, fighting wars of expansion and suppression in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Soldiers died in tropical fevers, in ambush attacks, in battlefield charges against enemies armed with spears or rifles. Many were buried where they fell, in hastily dug graves marked by temporary crosses that would vanish within years. But others, particularly officers whose families had means and influence, were returned to Britain for burial in consecrated ground. These repatriated bodies arrived at London's docks in sealed metal coffins, were collected by military undertakers, and frequently made their final journey to Brookwood on the Necropolis Railway. The Crimean War of 1854 to 1856 produced Britain's first large-scale experience with distant military casualties returning home for burial. The conflict against Russia in the Black Sea region killed thousands of British soldiers, most from disease rather than combat. Cholera and typhus swept through military camps where sanitation was primitive and medical care inadequate. Men who had survived the voyage from Britain and the initial engagements died in hospital tents, their bodies prepared for burial by overworked medical orderlies who struggled to keep pace with mortality. Most Crimean dead were buried in military cemeteries near Sevastopol, their graves eventually marked by uniform white headstones arranged in neat rows that would become familiar sights wherever British forces campaigned. But wealthier families could arrange for their sons' or husbands' bodies to be returned to England. The bodies were placed in lead-lined coffins, sealed to prevent decomposition gases from escaping during the long sea voyage home. These coffins were loaded onto naval vessels returning to Portsmouth or Southampton, where they still were transferred to railway transport for conveyance to London and onward to Brookwood. The military funerals at Brookwood followed protocols distinct from civilian burials. The coffins were draped with Union flags. Military bands sometimes attended, though not for junior ranks whose families lacked resources to arrange such honours. Officers received gun salutes, the reports echoing across the cemetery grounds, startling civilian mourners attending nearby burials. The graves were marked with military insignia, indicating regiment and rank. The inscriptions recorded not just names and dates, but service records, where the deceased had served, what campaigns he had participated in, what battles he'd survived before the final injury or illness claimed him. Lieutenant Colonel James Burnaby, who died of wounds received at the Battle of Inkerman in November 1854, was interred at Brookwood in a first-class plot his family purchased near the Anglican chapel. His monument was an elaborate marble column topped by a draped urn, the base carved with relief images of military equipment, crossed swords, a soldier's helmet, a furled flag. The inscription listed his 32 years of service, the campaigns in India and the Crimea, the wounds he had survived in previous engagements before the Russian artillery shell that finally killed him. His widow visited the grave weekly for the remainder of her life, maintaining flowers even during winter months, refusing to accept that her husband rested in Surrey earth rather than the Crimean soil where he had fallen. The Indian Mutiny of 1857 produced another wave of military dead returning to Brookwood. The rebellion of native troops against British rule generated vicious fighting characterised by atrocities on both sides. British forces suppressed the uprising with deliberate brutality, executing rebels by cannon fire and conducting reprisal massacres. But British casualties were substantial, particularly during the sieges of Delhi and Lucknow, where soldiers died in tropical heat while suffering from dysentery and cholera, alongside wounds from musket fire and artillery. The bodies that returned from India arrived in sealed coffins that had survived journeys of several months. The metal containers had been soldered shut before leaving India, but despite precautions, some leaked fluids that stained ship cargo holds and railway carriage floors. The undertakers at Westminster Bridge Road learned to handle these coffins with particular care, never opening them despite family requests to view the deceased one final time. The state of bodies that had been dead for months in tropical heat could not be made presentable. Better to leave the coffins sealed, to allow families to remember their dead as they had been in life, rather than confront the reality of decomposition. Captain Richard Fenton, who died during the Siege of Lucknow in September 1857, was buried at Brookwood after his body finally reached England in March 1858, 6 months after his death. His family erected a monument depicting a grieving angel, her head bowed in sorrow, one hand resting on a sword that symbolized his military service. The inscription described him as a hero who gave his life defending British civilization against savage rebellion. His mother visited the grave only once, unable to bear the knowledge that the sealed coffin in Surrey earth contained remains barely recognizable as her son. The Afghan Wars, the Zulu Wars, the various punitive expeditions against African and Asian peoples who resisted British control all produced casualties that sometimes made their way to Brookwood. The cemetery's military section expanded steadily, filling with monuments to soldiers who had died in places most British civilians could not locate on maps. The inscriptions recorded exotic place names: Kandahar, Kabul, Isandlwana, Rorke's Drift, locations that existed in public consciousness primarily as sites where British soldiers had fought and died. The military burials reflected the class system that governed civilian interments. Officers received elaborate funerals with full military honours. Their graves were marked by expensive monuments commissioned by families or funded through regimental subscription. The inscriptions emphasised honour, duty, sacrifice for empire. These were men who had led troops into battle, whose deaths represented loss of leadership and experience. They received burial appropriate to their station, recognition of their service, permanent commemoration in stone. Common soldiers who died in imperial service and whose bodies were repatriated received less elaborate treatment. Their coffins travelled in third-class hearse carriages. Their burials occurred without military bands or gun salutes. Their graves were marked by simple headstones, when they were marked at all. Some were buried in the military equivalent of common graves, trenches where multiple bodies rested together, identified by regimental lists rather than individual monuments. The Empire consumed these men and disposed of their bodies with minimal ceremony, their deaths noted in War Office records but otherwise forgotten. The Necropolis Railway also carried casualties of industrial accidents, workers killed in the factories and construction sites and dock facilities that drove Britain's economic expansion. The Victorian period was extraordinarily dangerous for working-class labourers. Factory machinery operated without safety guards. Construction projects proceeded without scaffolding or fall protection. Dock workers handled cargo using equipment that frequently failed, crushing men beneath falling crates or drowning them when ships' loads shifted unexpectedly. Mining was particularly lethal, with cave-ins and gas explosions killing workers regularly in the coal pits that fueled Britain's industry. These industrial dead often had no families capable of affording even third-class burial. They were consigned to Brookwood by employers who bore legal responsibility for disposing of bodies, but little moral obligation beyond that. The coffins were cheap pine boxes, the burials conducted without ceremony beyond the chaplain's required prayers. The graves were in remote sections marked by the numbered posts that weathered and collapsed within a few years. These men had laboured building Britain's industrial might, had sat when that machinery failed or crushed them, and were buried as cheaply as possible in ground far from the neighbourhoods where they had lived. Thomas Keeley, aged 23, died in November 1861 when scaffolding collapsed during construction of a railway bridge in Suffolk. He fell 60 feet to the ground, surviving the impact with multiple broken bones and internal injuries that killed him 3 days later in Guy's Hospital. His employer arranged burial at Brookwood, purchasing the minimum third-class service. No family attended the funeral. Keely's parents had died when he was a child, and he had no siblings or close relatives. He was buried alone except for the gravediggers and chaplain. His grave marked only by post number 8847, his death noted in company ledgers as an expense against the bridge construction project. Disease produced Brookwood's steadiest flow of bodies. Victorian London was a breeding ground for infectious illnesses that killed across all social classes, though the poor suffered disproportionately. Cholera epidemics swept through overcrowded neighbourhoods periodically, killing hundreds in a matter of weeks. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated water supplies, producing agonising deaths preceded by weeks of suffering. Tuberculosis, called consumption, killed slowly but reliably, particularly attacking young adults in their most productive years. Smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever. The Victorian disease catalogue was extensive and deadly. The poor died at far higher rates than the wealthy. Overcrowded housing, inadequate nutrition, polluted water, lack of medical care, occupational exposures to toxic substances. Every aspect of working class life reduced life expectancy and increased vulnerability and disease. Infant mortality was horrifyingly high in London's slums, with nearly half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. The surviving children grew up stunted and weakened, their bodies damaged by malnutrition and pollution, vulnerable to diseases that might spare better fed and healthier populations. These deaths produced a constant stream of coffins arriving at the necropolis terminus. The cholera epidemics of 1849 and 1854 had overwhelmed London's burial capacity, contributing directly to the crisis that led to Brookwood's establishment. But even in non-epidemic years, disease produced steady mortality that required constant burial capacity. The funeral trains carried these disease victims to Surrey, their bodies sealed in coffins that had been hastily constructed and quickly buried to prevent further contagion. The cemetery staff learned to recognise disease deaths by various signs. The small coffins that indicated infant mortality, the young adults who had died from consumption, the sealed metal containers that suggested cholera or typhoid cases requiring extra precautions. The gravediggers developed superstitions about disease victims, refusing to open graves near where recent disease deaths had been buried, convinced that miasma from the bodies might infect them. The medical theories that attributed disease to bad air rather than microscopic organisms gave these superstitions apparent scientific justification, making the gravediggers' fears seem rational rather than merely emotional. The volume of burials varied seasonally. Winter produced mortality spikes as respiratory diseases killed the young, the old and the weakened. Summer brought cholera and typhoid, waterborne diseases that flourished in warm weather. Spring and autumn saw lower mortality, though never completely absent. The gravediggers worked year-round, but their labour intensified during winter and summer months when death rates climbed and the burial schedule expanded to accommodate increased demand. The Necropolis Railway adjusted its operations to match mortality patterns. During epidemic periods, additional funeral trains were scheduled, sometimes running 3 or 4 times daily instead of the normal twice-daily service. The cemetery hired additional gravediggers on temporary contracts, men who worked until the epidemic subsided, and burial rates returned to normal levels. The whole operation scaled up and down with London's mortality rates. A commercial enterprise that prospered when death flourished and struggled during periods of relative health. The railway's success depended fundamentally on London's production of corpses, and Victorian London was extraordinarily productive. The combination of overcrowding, pollution, industrial accidents, disease and imperial warfare generated mortality on a scale that required industrial solutions. The Necropolis Railway was that solution, a transportation system devoted entirely to moving the dead from the city that killed them to the ground that would receive them. It was efficient, profitable, and utterly dependent on the continuation of circumstances that killed Londoners in steady numbers year after year, the weight of empire, of industrial expansion, of urban growth unconstrained by sanitary infrastructure or worker protections or public health measures. All this weight fell eventually on Brookwood's sandy soil, transformed into rows of graves that extended farther each year, consuming more of the original heathland, filling Surrey with London's dead. The cemetery expanded constantly, purchasing additional land as existing sections filled, always planning for future mortality that would require space not yet opened. By 1870, Brookwood had received over 40,000 burials. By 1890, that number had doubled. The cemetery was becoming a city of the dead more populous than many living cities, a necropolis in the literal sense, a place where the deceased accumulated in numbers that overwhelmed imagination. And still the trains continued running. Still the coffins arrived each morning. Still the gravediggers opened the earth to receive another day's cargo of mortality. The empire's dead, the industry's dead, the disease's dead, the accident's dead, the poverty's dead. All of them made their final journey on the iron road to Brookwood, where they were sorted by class and denomination, and consigned to Surrey earth that would hold them until the promised resurrection, or until the earth itself ended, whichever came first. Chapter 8. The Forgotten Cargo. The records kept by the London Necropolis Company told a story of ordered efficiency, of names and dates and plot numbers meticulously entered into ledgers that would be preserved in perpetuity. But beneath this bureaucratic surface existed another population of dead, bodies that arrived at Brookwood without names, without mourners, without anyone to mark their passage from the world of the living. These were the forgotten cargo, the unclaimed and unknown, the human beings who had died alone in a city of millions and whose bodies were disposed of with no more ceremony than the removal of refuse from the streets. The Metropolitan Police maintained a morgue where bodies were brought when found in circumstances suggesting no immediate family or identification. A man discovered dead in a lodging house, his rent weeks overdue, his possessions consisting of nothing but ragged clothes and a few pence. A woman pulled from the Thames, her body bloated from days in the water, her features distorted beyond recognition. An infant found abandoned in an alley, already dead from exposure or deliberate violence. These bodies accumulated in the morgue's cold rooms, awaiting identification that often never came. The police made efforts according to protocols established by law. They searched the deceased for papers, letters, anything indicating identity or next of kin. They published descriptions in newspapers, hoping someone might recognize the details and come forward. They displayed bodies at the morgue for public viewing, a grim practice where people seeking missing relatives walked past rows of corpses, hoping to find or hoping not to find the person they sought. Some bodies were identified through these methods and claimed by families who then arranged burial according to their means. But many remained unknown, and after the legally required period of display, they had to be disposed of somehow. The workhouses also produced unclaimed dead in substantial numbers. These institutions housed the destitute elderly, the chronically ill, the mentally incapacitated, the abandoned children, all those who fell through the gaps in Victorian society's inadequate social provision. The workhouse residents died regularly, their weakened bodies succumbing to disease or simply to the accumulated damage of poverty and neglect. Some had families who were notified and who arranged burial, extracting their dead from the workhouse system. But many had no one, or had families who refused to acknowledge them, or had outlived everyone who might have cared about their passing. The hospitals for the incurable, the lunatic asylums, the fever hospitals, all generated populations of dead whose bodies had no destination beyond whatever disposal system existed for the unclaimed. The medical schools received some of these bodies for anatomical study, a practice legalized by the Anatomy Act of 1832 in response to the body-snatching scandals of earlier decades. But the medical school's demand was limited, and most unclaimed bodies were simply buried at public expense in whatever ground the parish or institution designated. Brookwood received a substantial portion of London's unclaimed dead, bodies delivered by parish authorities who had contracted with the Necropolis Company for disposal services. The economics were favourable for both parties. The parishes paid minimal fees, far less than traditional churchyard burial would have cost. The Necropolis Company accepted the bodies because even minimal fees multiplied by hundreds of corpses generated acceptable revenue, and the common graves that received the unclaimed could accommodate dozens of bodies at negligible additional cost once the initial excavation was complete. These burials occurred without the ceremonies that attended even the poorest third-class funerals. There were no mourners, no services in the cemetery chapels, no individual graveside prayers. The coffins, if they could be called that, were rough wooden boxes constructed to minimum standards, sometimes mere shrouds nailed between boards. They arrived at Brookwood in dedicated railway cars stacked like cargo, identified only by numbered tags tied to handles or nailed to lids. The cemetery workers unloaded them with mechanical efficiency, transferred them to carts and transported them to the common graves awaiting their arrival. The gravediggers lowered the coffins into trenches that already held previous layers of unclaimed dead. The bodies were arranged in rows, packed as tightly as possible to maximize the grave's capacity. Earth was shoveled over each layer, just enough to provide separation from the bodies that would be placed above. The process continued until the trench reached capacity, at which point it was finally filled completely and mounded over. A single wooden post marked the entire common grave, identified by number rather than names, corresponding to ledger entries that listed the unknown bodies buried in that location. The ledgers attempted to maintain some record. Unknown male, approximately 40 years of age, found deceased in lodging house on Commercial Road, February 12, 1863. Unknown female, elderly, died in Lambeth Workhouse, March 3, 1863. Infant, sex undetermined, found abandoned April 17, 1863. The descriptions were minimal, recording only the most basic facts. The clerks who wrote these entries worked through lists of unclaimed dead with the same bureaucratic detachment they applied to named burials. Each body generated paperwork, even if that paperwork documented only the absence of identity and connection. Some of the unclaimed had been someone once, had lived lives that mattered to people who knew them. But those connections had been severed by circumstance, migration from rural areas to London, where they knew no one, family estrangements that left them isolated, the simple attrition that came from outliving everyone who might have cared. They died alone in a crowded city, their bodies discovered by landlords or police or hospital staff, and were processed through systems designed to dispose of them with minimum expense and complication. Others had been invisible even in life. The vagrant poor who slept in doorways and survived through begging or petty crime, people whose existence was acknowledged only when they became nuisances requiring removal. The prostitutes who worked the streets until disease or violence killed them, women whose names were unknown even to those who used their bodies, the children abandoned at birth or shortly after, infants whose mothers could not or would not keep them, who died before anyone bothered to record their brief existence. These lives left no trace except burial entries documenting unknown bodies disposed of in common graves. The mentally ill who died in asylums often joined the ranks of unclaimed dead, even when their names were known. Families who had committed relatives to institutional care sometimes refused to acknowledge them after death, unwilling to bear the expense or social stigma of burial. The asylum authorities would wait a statutory period for family response, and receiving none, would consign the body to the unclaimed category. The dead person's name might be recorded in asylum records, but at Brookwood they became simply another unknown, another body-filling space in a common grave. The seasonal mortality spikes that brought increased burial business to Brookwood produced corresponding increases in unclaimed dead. Winter cold killed the homeless who slept rough, their bodies found frozen in alleys or under bridges. Summer epidemics killed the poorest residents of overcrowded slums, people whose deaths often went unreported for days until the smell of decomposition alerted neighbours. These bodies arrived at the morgue or workhouse in batches, overwhelming the limited capacity for individual processing, and were sent to Brookwood for mass burial. The cemetery workers who handled these forgotten dead developed attitudes ranging from indifference to active contempt. Some viewed the unclaimed as cautionary examples, evidence of what happened to people who failed to maintain family connections or accumulate resources sufficient for respectable burial. Others saw them simply as cargo, no different from any other coffins requiring burial, except for the absence of mourning families who might complain about rough handling. The gravediggers worked the common graves with mechanical efficiency, lowering bodies, shoveling earth, moving to the next task without reflection on the human lives they were disposing of. But some cemetery workers found the unclaimed burials disturbing in ways that ordinary funerals were not. The chaplains who were required to perform cursory prayers over common graves before they were filled sometimes questioned the meaning of their ritual words. They were commending souls to God's mercy when they did not even know the souls' names, speaking prayers over bodies that might include anyone from innocent children to violent criminals. The liturgy seemed hollow in these circumstances. Religious formulas applied to situations that mocked the individual spiritual concern that Christianity supposedly guaranteed. The cemetery administration struggled with record-keeping challenges posed by the unclaimed dead. The elaborate system designed to track named burials and ensure relatives could locate graves years later became meaningless when bodies had no names and no relatives. The numbered posts that marked common graves provided minimal information. Which trench, which year, but nothing about individuals buried there. If someone later came forward claiming to be searching for a missing relative who might have been buried as unclaimed, the cemetery could offer no help beyond showing them the section where unknown bodies from a particular period had been interred. Occasionally, identifications occurred after burial, when someone finally recognized a missing person from morgue descriptions published weeks earlier, or when investigations revealed that someone reported as missing had actually died and been buried as unclaimed. In such cases, families might request exhumation and reburial in individual graves, a process the cemetery permitted but charged substantial fees to perform. Most families lacked resources for this, and the bodies remained in common graves even after identification, their names added to cemetery records, but their physical remains irretrievable from the mass of unknown dead. The forgotten cargo also included bodies rejected by other burial grounds, for various reasons. Suicides whose deaths violated religious and civil law were officially denied Christian burial in consecrated ground. The Anglican Church maintained that self-murder was mortal sin, that those who killed themselves died unrepentant and could not receive church blessing. Many parish clergy refused to conduct funeral services for suicides, and some churchyards would not accept their bodies. These dead were buried in unconsecrated portions of cemeteries, sometimes at crossroads or boundary areas that occupied spiritual margins. Brookwood accommodated these rejected dead in sections set aside for burials outside consecrated ground. The company made no moral judgments. A body was a body, and disposal was a commercial service regardless of how death had occurred. The suicides were buried without religious ceremony in graves that received no monuments, their deaths noted in records with clinical brevity. The families, when there were families, conducted private mourning without the comfort of religious ritual, bearing the additional burden of social stigma that Victorian society attached to self-inflicted death. The executed criminals, those hanged at Newgate or other prisons, were buried in prison grounds according to law, their bodies denied return to families or burial in public cemeteries. But those who died in prison from disease or violence before execution sometimes ended at Brookwood among the unclaimed, their criminal status noted in ledgers, but not preventing their disposal in common graves alongside paupers and unknowns. The dead criminal and the dead vagrant occupied the same trenches, the same anonymous earth, democracy achieved only in the complete erasure of individual identity and history. The scale of unclaimed burials at Brookwood was substantial enough to constitute a significant portion of cemetery operations. During the 1860s, hundreds of unclaimed bodies arrived each year, possibly over 1,000 in epidemic years. The common graves expanded to accommodate them, entire sections of the cemetery devoted to the forgotten dead, marked only by weathering wooden posts that recorded numbers without names. These sections were never landscaped with the care given to paying customers' burial grounds. No trees were planted, no paths maintained. The earth was left rough after burial, grass growing wild over the settled mounds. Families purchasing individual graves sometimes complained about proximity to the common burial sections, uncomfortable with the knowledge that their respectable dead rested near trenches filled with unknowns and paupers. The cemetery administration attempted to segregate the sections, placing common graves at maximum distance from first-class burial areas. But the geography of mortality could not be completely controlled. The dead accumulated according to the order of their arrival and the availability of space, and sometimes the forgotten cargo came to rest near those whose families had purchased perpetual plots and expected perpetual separation from the common dead. The forgotten cargo represented a particular failure of Victorian society, evidence that the elaborate systems of family, community, and charitable provision that supposedly protected the vulnerable had failed for these individuals. They had lived and died in a city of millions, yet their deaths went unmarked and unmourned, their bodies disposed of as waste requiring sanitary removal. They were the underside of Victorian progress, the human cost of urban growth and industrial expansion that created conditions in which people could become completely isolated despite living in densely populated neighbourhoods. The London Necropolis Railway carried them to their final destination without ceremony or acknowledgement, wooden boxes stacked in hearse carriages designed for more respectable cargo. The train travelled the same route for both the wealthy in their mahogany coffins and the unknown in their rough wooden shrouds, but the journey's end differed completely. Some dead arrived at individual graves marked by monuments that would endure centuries. Others descended into common trenches where they would remain forever unnamed, forever forgotten, their brief existence leaving no more trace than a number in a ledger that no one would ever consult. In a common grave no one would ever visit, in a remote section of a cemetery too large for anyone to comprehend. The earth received them all equally, but memory and commemoration were reserved for those who had maintained connections and accumulated resources. The forgotten cargo had neither, and that they vanished into Surrey ground as completely as if they had never existed, evidence only in cemetery records of bodies disposed of, spaces filled, transactions completed. The machinery of burial processed them efficiently, and the Necropolis Railway carried them one final time, and then they were gone, forgotten even in the moment of their burial, anonymous components in the vast accumulation of mortality that filled Brookwood's expanding grounds. Chapter 9. The Iron Shroud. The London Necropolis Railway operated with mechanical regularity for 85 years, carrying its cargo of dead and mourners through peace and war, prosperity and depression, the long Victorian afternoon and the violent upheavals that ended Britain's imperial confidence. The trains ran through the Boer War, through the death of Queen Victoria, through the Edwardian period's final flourish of imperial pageantry. They continued running through the Great War of 1914 to 1918, though the cargo changed as the military casualties arrived in unprecedented numbers. Young men killed in France and Belgium returning home in sealed coffins for burial at Brookwood or other cemeteries. The First World War transformed Brookwood into something approaching a military cemetery, with entire sections devoted to war dead. The government established a military burial ground within the cemetery, later maintained by the Imperial War Graves Commission. The graves were marked by uniform white headstones, thousands of them, arranged in perfect rows that stretched across acres of ground. The inscriptions recorded names, ranks, regiments, dates of death compressed into a few years of industrial slaughter. The sheer numbers overwhelmed comprehension. Not dozens of war dead, but thousands, a generation destroyed in trenches and bombardments and gas attacks. The Necropolis Railway adapted to wartime conditions, increasing service to accommodate the flow of military funerals. The trains ran fuller than ever, multiple hearse carriages carrying coffins draped in flags, compartments filled with grieving familiars who had received telegrams beginning with the words, "The War Office regrets to inform you." The cemetery staff worked extended hours, grave diggers excavating plots as quickly as possible. chaplains conducting multiple services daily, the whole operation strained by the unprecedented demand. But the railway survived the Great War and continued operating through the 1920s and 30s, decades marked by economic depression and social change. The burial business remained steady if not growing. London's population continued generating mortality requiring disposal, and Brookwood remained the largest cemetery serving this capital. The funeral trains ran with reduced frequency compared to Victorian peak periods, but they still departed Westminster Bridge Road each morning, still carried their cargo to Surrey, still returned in the afternoon having delivered another day's dead to consecrated ground. The railway infrastructure aged. The original funeral carriages, built in the 1850s, were replaced with updated vehicles in the early 20th century, but even these showed wear by the 1930s. The Westminster Bridge Road terminus required constant maintenance, its Victorian-era systems increasingly obsolete. The cemetery grounds matured, the young trees planted in the 1850s now towering over graves, the landscape transformed from managed garden into something more wild, less cultivated. The company's finances remained adequate but not robust, burial services generating steady income without the profitability of earlier decades. The outbreak of war in September 1939 brought new uncertainties. Britain once again mobilised for conflict, this time against Nazi Germany, in a struggle that would prove even more destructive than the Great War. The government implemented civil defence measures, built air raid shelters, distributed gas masks, prepared for aerial bombardment that everyone knew would come. London, as Britain's capital and largest city, would be a primary target. The question was not whether German bombs would fall on London, but when and how devastating the assault would be. The London Necropolis Railway continued operating through the early months of war, the period of false calm called the Phony War when military mobilisation proceeded, but major combat operations had not yet begun. The funeral trains ran on reduced schedules, fuel and resources directed toward military priorities, but the essential service continued. The dead still required burial, and Brookwood remained their destination. The German air offensive against Britain began in earnest during the summer of 1940, bombing campaigns initially targeting airfields and military installations before shifting to civilian areas in what became known as the Blitz. London suffered particularly intense bombardment, German aircraft appearing over the city night after night beginning in September 1940. Dropping high explosive bombs and incendiaries across the metropolitan area. The bombing was indiscriminate, aimed at destroying civilian morale through mass casualties and widespread destruction. The raids transformed London into a landscape of rubble and fire. Buildings collapsed under direct hits, burying occupants in debris. Incendiary bombs started fires that spread through neighbourhoods, consuming entire blocks. High explosive bombs cratered streets. Ruptured water and gas mains brought down structures that had stood for centuries. The casualties were enormous. Thousands killed in the first weeks of the Blitz, tens of thousands injured, hundreds of thousands made homeless. The morgues filled beyond capacity. The hospitals overflowed with wounded. The civil defence services struggled to rescue survivors and remove bodies from collapsed buildings. The dead accumulated faster than burial services could process them. The traditional system of individual funerals with grieving families accompanying coffins to cemeteries became impossible under sustained bombardment. Mass casualties required mass burials, bodies collected from bomb sites and taken to temporary mortuaries for identification when possible, before being coffined and transported to cemeteries. The Necropolis Railway attempted to maintain service, but the nightly raids disrupted everything. The trains could not operate safely during air attacks. The routes through London passed through bombed areas where tracks might be damaged or blocked by debris. The Westminster Bridge Road terminus, that Victorian building devoted to managing death with appropriate ceremony, became vulnerable in ways its designers had never imagined. The station stood in central London, surrounded by a railway infrastructure that made it a potential target. The nearby Waterloo station suffered bomb damage during raids. The warehouses and industrial buildings around the Necropolis terminus were hit repeatedly. The area became dangerous, shrapnel and unexploded bombs making every journey hazardous. On the night of April 16, 1941, German bombers conducted a massive raid on London, dropping hundreds of tons of explosives and incendiaries across the city. The raid targeted the area around Waterloo, aiming to disrupt the railway junction's military significance. High explosive bombs fell across the district, destroying buildings, cratering streets, starting fires that burned through the night. The raid lasted hours, wave after wave of aircraft passing over the city while anti-aircraft guns fired and searchlights swept the sky. The London Necropolis station received a direct hit. A high explosive bomb, probably 500 pounds, penetrated the building and detonated inside, destroying the structure completely. The walls collapsed inward, the roof fell. The interior spaces devoted to waiting rooms and ticket offices and their careful management of Victorian mortality vanished in an instant of explosive force. The blast scattered debris across Westminster Bridge Road, shattered windows in surrounding buildings, killed everyone inside the station at the moment of impact. The station staff on duty that night died instantly. The building collapsed on top of them, tons of brick and timber and iron crushing bodies beyond recognition. The funeral carriages in the adjacent sidings were destroyed, blasted apart by the explosion's force or consumed by fires that followed. The carefully maintained records, those ledgers documenting decades of burials, were incinerated. The waiting rooms where generations of mourners had gathered before making their final journeys with the dead, all of it gone, reduced to rubble and ash and twisted metal. The morning after the raid revealed the extent of destruction. The Necropolis terminus existed only as a crater filled with debris, smoke still rising from smouldering wreckage. Rescue workers searching for survivors found only bodies. Cemetery workers and railway employees who had been attempting to maintain operations despite the bombardment. The neighbouring buildings were damaged, some collapsed entirely, others standing but structurally unsound. The railway tracks were torn up. The sidings where funeral trains had waited were filled with wreckage. The entire facility was gone, destroyed so completely that rebuilding seemed impossible. The London Necropolis Company faced an immediate crisis. The terminus had been essential infrastructure, the hub through which all funeral traffic passed. Without it, the company could not operate its railway service. The funeral trains could not depart from Waterloo without the private station that had kept death separate from ordinary passenger traffic. The company briefly considered rebuilding, constructing a new terminus elsewhere, restoring the service that had operated successfully for 85 years. But the practical obstacles were overwhelming. The war had created resource scarcities that made major construction impossible. Materials were rationed for military priorities. Labour was unavailable, conscripted for war work or military service. The railway company that had provided the actual train operations was struggling to maintain military transport schedules and had no capacity for rebuilding specialised funeral services. The insurance compensation for the destroyed terminus was inadequate for reconstruction costs. And most fundamentally, the war had changed everything, making pre-war business models obsolete, forcing adaptation to circumstances that no one had anticipated. The company made the decision in May 1941. The London Necropolis Railway would cease operations permanently. The daily funeral trains that had run for 85 years would not run again. The service that had carried hundreds of thousands of dead from London to Brookwood was finished, ended by German bombs that had accomplished in one night what decades of competition from motor hearses and changing burial practices had not achieved. The cemetery itself continued operating. Brookwood remained London's largest burial ground, and bodies continued arriving, though now by motor hearse rather than railway. The funeral traffic that had once travelled by dedicated train service now made the journey on congested roads, subject to traffic delays and fuel rationing. The efficiency and scale that had characterised the railway operation were lost. The twice-daily trains that had carried dozens of coffins and hundreds of mourners were replaced by individual funeral processions, making the 23-mile journey one at a time. The wartime burials at Brookwood included many casualties of the Blitz, civilians killed in the bombing raids that continued through 1941 and returned intermittently until the war's end. The cemetery workers dug graves for entire families killed together when bombs destroyed their homes. They buried civil defense workers killed while attempting rescues. They interred unidentified bodies, victims too badly damaged for recognition, adding to the cemetery's population of unknown dead. The war produced mortality on a scale approaching epidemic disease, and Brookwood absorbed London's war dead just as it had absorbed the city's peacetime mortality for 9 decades. The railway tracks that had carried the funeral trains remained in place for years after service ended, rusting gradually, becoming overgrown with vegetation. The route from London to Brookwood could still be traced by the rails embedded in ballast, by the bridges and cuttings that had been constructed specifically for the funeral service. But the trains never ran again. The specialised funeral carriages, those few that survived the Westminster Bridge Road bombing, were scrapped or converted to other uses. The infrastructure that had supported the service gradually disappeared, demolished or absorbed into other railway operations. The Victorian building that had served as the Necropolis terminus was never rebuilt. The bomb site was cleared, the rubble removed, but the property stood vacant for years. Eventually it was sold and redeveloped for other purposes, all trace of the station erased. The site became offices and shops, ordinary commercial buildings with no indication that they stood where Victorian mourners had once gathered to accompany their dead on iron roads to Surrey burial grounds. The cemetery stations at Brookwood suffered different fates. The North Station, serving Anglican burials, was also damaged by the German bombs during the war, struck in a raid that destroyed much of the structure. The South Station, for nonconformist burials, survived the war, but fell into disuse after railway service ended. Both stations gradually deteriorated, maintenance deferred, the buildings slowly collapsing. Eventually they were demolished, the sites cleared, the elaborate Victorian architecture that had facilitated transfer from railway to cemetery simply gone, existing only in photographs and the memories of those who had witnessed funeral arrivals during the railway's operating years. The Iron Shroud had descended on the London Necropolis Railway, German bombs providing the violent conclusion to a service that had operated continuously since 1854. The railway that had solved Victorian London's burial crisis, that had carried mortality to Surrey for nearly 9 decades, that had processed hundreds of thousands of funerals with mechanical efficiency, it ended abruptly, destroyed in a single night by explosives dropped from aircraft that represented technologies unimaginable when the railway had been conceived. The war would continue for 4 more years, producing casualties that dwarfed even the Great War's horrific toll. Britain would survive, battered and exhausted, victorious but bankrupt, its empire beginning the dissolution that would accelerate in the post-war decades. London would be rebuilt, the bomb damage gradually repaired, the city resuming its function as Britain's capital. But the London Necropolis Railway was finished, a Victorian innovation that had operated into the 20th century but could not survive the violence of modern total war. The trains had carried the dead for 85 years, and then they stopped, and the silence that followed was absolute. Chapter 10. The Whispers That Remain, the London Necropolis Cemetery at Brookwood, continues operating in the 21st century, a functioning burial ground that receives interments nearly 2 centuries after its establishment. The cemetery occupies those same 2,000 acres of Surrey heathland, though the landscape has changed beyond recognition from the empty ground that Victorian workers first encountered. The young trees planted in the 1850s have grown ancient, their roots penetrating deep into soil layered with human remains. The carefully planned avenues have been obscured by decades of undergrowth. The sections that were once meticulously maintained according to class and denomination have merged into a continuous woodland cemetery where nature has reclaimed much of the ground. The graves themselves remain, though many are difficult to locate. The elaborate Victorian monuments that marked first-class burials still stand in some sections. Angels and obelisks and Celtic crosses, weathered by a century and more of Surrey rain. The inscriptions have become illegible on many stones, the carved letters filled with moss and lichen, the words that once proclaimed names and dates and virtues now reduced to vague shadows on eroding surfaces. The second-class headstones have fared worse, the local stone having weathered more rapidly than imported marble, many stones broken or fallen, inscriptions completely gone. The third-class sections, those areas marked originally only by wooden posts, are nearly invisible. The posts rotted decades ago, leaving no markers at all. The graves exist only as slight depressions in the forest floor, indentations where earth settled as coffins collapsed underground. Someone walking through these sections would pass over hundreds of graves without realizing they were traversing ground thick with the dead. The numbered posts that once identified each burial are gone, the painted numbers faded first and then the wood itself disintegrating, returning to the soil it had marked. The common graves for pauper burials have vanished entirely from surface view. The trenches that once received dozens of bodies in stacked layers have settled into the landscape, indistinguishable from surrounding ground except in cemetery records that document their locations with coordinates that would require surveying equipment to locate precisely. The single post that marked each common grave lasted no longer than the individual grave markers, rotting away until nothing remained to indicate that beneath particular patches of woodland lie the anonymous remains of hundreds of London's forgotten dead. The cemetery administration maintains records inherited from the Victorian-era company, ledgers and maps documenting more than 200,000 burials conducted since 1854. These records allow families to locate graves when they possess specific information, names, dates, plot numbers. But the process of searching is difficult, requiring hours of archive work followed by expeditions into overgrown cemetery sections where landmarks have disappeared and paths have been absorbed by vegetation. Many families seeking ancestors' graves give up, unable to locate burial sites in the vast wooded landscape. The railway infrastructure that once connected London to Brookwood has also largely disappeared. The tracks that carried funeral trains for 85 years were removed in the 1960s during railway modernisation programmes. The route can still be traced through landscape features, embankments and cuttings, bridge abutments, property boundaries that follow the old right-of-way, but the rails themselves are gone, sold for scrap or buried under new development. The land has been repurposed for other uses or simply left to grow wild. Another component of Victorian infrastructure that outlived its function and was gradually erased. The North Station at Brookwood, damaged by German bombs and never repaired, was demolished in the 1950s. The site is now part of the cemetery's maintenance area, storage buildings and equipment sheds occupying the ground where Victorian mourners once disembarked from funeral trains. The South Station survived longer, but was eventually demolished in the 1960s, its Victorian Gothic architecture considered obsolete and expensive to maintain. Nothing remains of either station except foundation traces occasionally visible when ground is disturbed for new burials. The cemetery chapels, those substantial Victorian buildings where funeral services were conducted, have suffered varied fates. The Anglican chapel underwent renovation in the 1990s and remains in occasional use for services. The nonconformist chapel was demolished after war damage made repair uneconomical. The Catholic chapel survives but stands empty, no longer used for religious functions. These buildings that once hosted hundreds of funerals annually now sit silent, reminders of the cemetery's Victorian peak when daily funeral trains brought steady streams of mourners to witness burials. The military sections established during the World Wars are the best maintained areas of the cemetery. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission tends these plots with care, replacing damaged headstones, maintaining grass, ensuring the war dead receive the perpetual care that was promised to those who died in service. These sections stand in marked contrast to the rest of the cemetery, ordered and maintained while civilian areas have been absorbed by nature. The white headstones march in perfect rows, thousands of them, permanent markers for soldiers whose deaths in 2 world wars are considered worthy of remembrance, while the civilian dead surrounding them fade into obscurity. The cemetery receives new burials, though far fewer than during Victorian times. Modern cremation has reduced demand for burial space, and Brookwood is no longer London's primary cemetery. New sections have been opened for contemporary interments, areas with organised plots and maintained paths, but these occupy only a small fraction of the original 2,000 acres. Most of the cemetery is effectively abandoned, too large to maintain, too historically significant to develop for other purposes, existing in a liminal state between functioning cemetery and historical artefact. Walking through Brookwood today is like moving through a forest that happens to contain human remains rather than through a cemetery that happens to have trees. The visitor encounters graves unexpectedly, monuments emerging from undergrowth, headstones leaning at angles where roots have undermined their foundations. The sense of organisation that characterised the Victorian cemetery has been lost. The careful divisions between sections, between classes, between denominations, all of these have been obscured by decades of forest growth. The dead lie mixed in earth that makes no distinction between the wealthy in their marble tombs and the poor in their unmarked graves. The silence is profound. Brookwood is far enough from major roads that traffic noise does not penetrate. The woodland absorbs sound, creating a hush, broken only by wind in the trees and occasional bird calls. This silence is different from the silence that prevailed when the cemetery was newly established, when the heath was open and exposed. That was the silence of empty space. This is the silence of abandonment, of a place once intensively used and maintained that has been gradually surrendered to nature. The whispers that remain are not supernatural, they are historical, the traces left by Victorian death management systems that transformed mortality into industrial process. The cemetery itself is the primary whisper, 2,000 acres of ground that document how Britain dealt with urban mortality during the period of greatest imperial power and industrial expansion. Every grave, every section, every trace of organisation reflects choices about how death should be managed, who deserved commemoration, which lives had value sufficient to merit permanent marking. The academic historians and cemetery researchers who study Brookwood have documented its history extensively. They have written books and articles examining the Necropolis Railway, analysing burial records, interpreting Victorian attitudes toward death through the physical evidence of cemetery organisation. These scholars have rescued the cemetery's history from complete obscurity, ensuring that the story of how London exported its dead by rail remains accessible to anyone curious about Victorian mortality management. But the scholarly attention has not translated into public awareness. Brookwood remains largely unknown outside specialist circles. Most Londoners have never heard of the cemetery, despite it being their city's largest burial ground. The Necropolis Railway exists in popular consciousness, if at all, as a curious footnote, a strange Victorian innovation documented in old photographs showing funeral trains and elaborate hearse carriages. The reality of what the railway represented, an industrial-scale system for removing the dead from an overcrowded city, has faded from memory. Some preservation efforts have been attempted. Historical societies have marked certain significant graves, installed information boards explaining the cemetery's history, conducted guided tours through the military sections and better preserved civilian areas. These efforts are well-intentioned but reach only small audiences. The cemetery is too large, too overgrown, too far from London to attract mass tourism. It remains a place known primarily to those with specific reasons to visit. Families maintaining ancestors' graves, military historians researching war burials, urban explorers fascinated by Victorian infrastructure. The traces of the railway operation persist in subtle ways. The cemetery roads follow routes designed for funeral train access, wider than necessary for modern vehicle traffic. The spacing between grave sections reflects the planning that anticipated multiple daily funeral trains arriving, with different classes and denominations requiring segregation. The overall layout of the cemetery, with its separate Anglican and nonconformist grounds connected by a central avenue, embodies the railway's two-station system that determined how bodies and mourners were distributed across the landscape. Individual graves occasionally reveal connections to the railway's operation. Cemetery workers who spent careers maintaining the grounds or digging graves are buried in sections they once tended. Station masters and railway employees who devoted decades to funeral train services rest in plots they helped administer. The chaplains who conducted thousands of funeral services lie beneath stones that mark their own passages into the ground they consecrated for others. These graves form a hidden population of death workers, people whose lives were shaped by their employment in mortality management. The forgotten cargo, those unclaimed and unknown bodies buried in common graves, remain forgotten. The trenches where they were interred have been absorbed into the forest floor, their locations documented in archives but unmarked on the ground. No one visits these graves because no one knows whose remains lie there. The bodies have decomposed completely after decades underground. The coffins collapsed, the bones mixed with soil and roots. They have become literally part of the landscape, their molecules dispersed through the earth, taken up by trees and undergrowth, cycling through the biological systems that transform human remains into components of forest ecology. The cemetery has become a habitat, home to wildlife that has colonized the undisturbed woodland. Deer browse among the graves. Foxes den in the undergrowth near Victorian monuments. Birds nest in trees that grow from roots penetrating coffins far below ground. The ecology of death has created the ecology of life. The nutrients from decomposed bodies supporting forest growth that in turn supports animal populations. The cemetery is not merely a repository for the dead, but a living system built on their remains. The metaphorical weight of this place is enormous when comprehended fully. 200,000 human beings, perhaps more, rest beneath these woods. Each body represents a life lived in London during Britain's imperial period. Someone who breathed the city's poisoned air, worked in its factories or offices or streets, died from its diseases or accidents or simply from age, and was transported here for burial. Each grave, whether marked or unmarked, documented or forgotten, represents the end of a human story, the final disposition of a body that once moved through the world with all the complexity that life entails. The Victorian confidence that built Brookwood has proven illusory. The cemetery was designed to provide perpetual burial, permanent resting places that would endure until the Christian resurrection or the end of time. But perpetuity has proven far shorter than eternity. Most graves have been forgotten within living memory. The monuments erected to ensure remembrance have weathered into illegibility. The systems established to maintain the cemetery have proven unsustainable. The dead who were supposed to rest in perpetual care have been gradually abandoned, left to the slow erasure of time and vegetation and institutional neglect. Yet the cemetery persists, and in its persistence lies a certain truth about mortality that the Victorians perhaps understood better than later generations. The dead accumulate. Bodies must be placed somewhere. The earth receives them all regardless of the elaborate systems humans devised to manage the process. Brookwood was built to solve a practical problem. London had too many corpses and insufficient space to bury them. The solution was to transport the bodies elsewhere, to open ground that could accommodate the constant flow of mortality that urban life generated. That solution worked for nearly a century, processing hundreds of thousands of burials with mechanical efficiency. The railway that facilitated this solution was destroyed by war, but the cemetery continues its function, receiving bodies still, though at a reduced rate. The trees grow tall on ground layered with human remains. The silence deepens as memory fades, and the dead rest in Surrey earth, far from the London streets where most of them lived, consigned to a vast woodland cemetery that few people visit and fewer still comprehend. The whispers that remain are quiet now, barely audible above the wind in the trees and the rustle of leaves falling on forgotten graves, but they persist, waiting for anyone curious enough to listen. to learn the history of how Victorian Britain managed death on an industrial scale, how the railway transformed burial into scheduled service, how London's dead were carried by iron road to consecrated ground that now grows wild with forest. The London Necropolis Railway is gone, its tracks removed, its stations demolished, its service ended by bombs that fell from the sky during humanity's most destructive war. But the cemetery remains, and the graves remain, and beneath the forest floor lie the bones of hundreds of citizens who made their final journey on funeral trains that no longer run. They are still there, still present in the landscape. Their stories mostly lost, but their physical remains embedded in the earth that will hold them until even bones disintegrate completely, and nothing remains but molecules cycling through soil and trees, and the endless processes of decay and regeneration that make death the foundation of life. The candle burned low, the evening deepened, and history once again turned the page in the dark, leaving only whispers where the funeral trains once ran. Thank you for listening to the Bedside Historian, and may your rest be peaceful tonight, wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour.